Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where the quietest stories are often the ones that never quite finished being told. The sea has always kept things. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of legends and sea monsters, but in a slower, more patient way. A shoe washes up on a beach and no one knows which ship it came from. A name carved into a dock post in some harbour town belongs to a man no one can trace anymore. The ocean collects these fragments, these half-finished moments, and holds them without explanation. It is not cruel about it. It simply does not feel the need to explain itself. And sometimes, very rarely, it gives something back. Not an answer, but a question in the shape of an object. A ship. A grounded, silent, five-masted schooner sitting on a sandbar off the coast of North Carolina with its sails still set, its anchors gone, its crew nowhere to be found, and dinner still warming on the stove. That is where we are tonight, the Carroll A Deering, found on the morning of January 31st, 1921. Hard aground on Diamond Shoals just off Cape Hatteras. She was not wrecked in the way that ships usually wreck. Her hull was intact, her sails were up. There was no sign of a catastrophic storm, no collapsed masts, no visible damage that would explain why she was sitting there on the shoals like something set down and forgotten. The crew of the Cape Hatteras lightship spotted her first, and what they saw must have been a strange and unsettling thing. A large vessel, fully rigged, apparently drifting with red distress lights set but no one visible on deck. No movement, no response to signals, just the ship, sitting there, quiet and still in the January morning. When investigators finally managed to board her, days later, they found the galley stove still lit. A pot of pork and beans, coffee ready, food prepared for 11 men who were not there. 11 men, gone. No bodies, no lifeboats on their davits, no note that turned out to be real, just the meal, the empty ship, and a steering mechanism that someone had deliberately smashed. That is what we're going to spend tonight with. That story. That question. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now as you listen to this? What does the night feel like where you are? Is it cold outside, the kind of cold that makes a ship's deck feel especially bleak to imagine? Or are you somewhere warm, somewhere the idea of a January morning off Cape Hatteras feels very far away? I find it interesting to think about the different places people are when they listen to stories like this one. Someone in a warm bed, someone on a night drive, someone with a cup of something hot somewhere quiet. Wherever you are, I hope it is comfortable, because this is a story worth settling in for. It is not a short one, and it is not a simple one, and it does not have a clean ending. But it is one of the most genuinely strange and carefully documented maritime mysteries in American history, and it deserves to be told slowly and properly. If you are enjoying what we do here at Life Beyond Scene, if you find these long, quiet explorations of strange and forgotten stories worth your time, I would be genuinely grateful if you hit the like button and subscribed. It helps this channel more than you might think, and it means these stories reach more people who might appreciate them. That is all I will say about that. Now, let us go back to 1921. To understand what made the discovery of the Carroll A Deering so disturbing, you have to understand what it looked like to the people who first saw her. The Cape Hatteras lightship was a floating lighthouse, anchored in place to warn ships away from the shallow, dangerous waters of Diamond Shoals. Its crew were experienced maritime men. They knew what a ship in distress looked like, and they knew what a ship behaving strangely looked like, and the Deering was doing something in between. She was grounded, but not violently. She was signalling distress, but no one was at the rail. She was fully rigged, which meant her sails were set as if she were underway, but she was not underway. She was just sitting there, on the shoals, in a way that did not make immediate sense. The lightship crew could not board her themselves. That was not their role. They reported what they saw and waited for the Coast Guard to respond. But the weather off Cape Hatteras in late January is not the kind of weather that makes maritime operations easy or quick. Diamond Shoals has been called the graveyard of the Atlantic for good reason. The currents there are unpredictable. The sandbars shift, the weather can change in a matter of hours, and the water is shallow in ways that are not always obvious until it is too late. More than 1,000 ships have wrecked in those waters over the centuries. The Deering was, in a way, just the latest addition to that count, except that most wrecks do not have food cooking in the galley. The Coast Guard cutter Seminole attempted to reach the ship first, but conditions prevented a boarding. It took until February 4th, 1921, 4 days after the Deering was first spotted, before investigators could actually get aboard. That is 4 days of the ship sitting there, grounded, empty, with whatever was left inside slowly going cold or going stale or just sitting. 4 days of a mystery waiting to be found. When they finally boarded her, what they discovered was specific enough to be haunting and strange enough to resist easy explanation. Both anchors were gone, not just raised and stowed, but physically absent, as if they had been cut or released in a hurry. The lifeboats were missing from their davits, the metal brackets where they should have been hanging. One lifeboat was found floating nearby, damaged, trailing behind the ship on a line, but it was in no condition to have carried 11 men safely anywhere. The steering gear, the mechanism that allowed the ship to be controlled, had been completely disabled. Not worn out, not damaged by weather, but smashed. Deliberately. The binnacle which housed the ship's compass was also destroyed. The ship's log was gone. Navigation equipment was missing. The captain's quarters and the officers' quarters had been ransacked. Personal belongings scattered or taken. And in the galley the stove was still lit. Pork and beans in one pot. Something else in another. Coffee ready to be poured. A meal prepared for the entire crew, as if whoever made it expected everyone to sit down and eat within the next few minutes. That detail, the food on the stove, is the thing that stays with people. It is the thing that makes this feel different from a simple shipwreck or a simple disappearance. A meal is an act of intention. Someone planned that meal, gathered the ingredients, lit the stove and started cooking with the expectation that the people they were cooking for would be there to eat it. The food on the stove is not just a detail. It is evidence of a normal morning that stopped being normal at some specific moment, for some specific reason, and then everyone was gone. 11 people, a functioning ship, dinner on the stove, and nothing else. The question that has followed the Carroll A Deering for more than 100 years is not complicated to state. It is only complicated to answer. What happened between the last time anyone saw this ship's crew alive and the morning of January 31st, 1921, when the ship was found empty on Diamond Shoals? What happened in that gap? What could cause 11 experienced maritime men to vanish from a seaworthy vessel, leaving food, cooking and the lights on and the steering gear deliberately destroyed, with no bodies, no survivors, no witnesses, and no explanation that anyone has ever been able to prove? That is the question. And we are going to spend the rest of tonight with it. I want to be straightforward with you about something before we go further. This story does not have a solved ending. It never has. The United States government investigated it at the highest levels. The State Department got involved. The Navy. The Bureau of Navigation. A special agent working under Herbert Hoover, who was at that time the Secretary of Commerce, conducted a formal inquiry. Hundreds of pages of documents were generated. Dozens of foreign governments were contacted. More than 2,000 ships were asked to watch for survivors or wreckage. And at the end of all of that, the official conclusion was essentially nothing. The case was not solved. It was not closed with an answer. It was simply set aside eventually because there was nothing left to investigate and no new information coming in. So we are going to look at this honestly. We are going to look at what the evidence actually says, what the most credible theories are, what we can say with reasonable confidence, and what we genuinely cannot. There are several explanations that have been put forward over the years. Mutiny, piracy, a natural disaster, something stranger. And each of them fits some of the evidence and fails to explain other parts of it. That is the nature of this case. It is not a mystery that yields to a single clean answer. It is a mystery that yields to more questions. But before we get to any of that, before we get to theories and investigations and government files, we need to understand the ship itself. We need to know who she was, where she came from, what she was doing in those waters in January of 1921, and who the 11 men aboard her were. Because the Carroll A Deering was not a ghost ship before she became one. She was a real vessel, built in a real shipyard, crewed by real men with names and families and histories, and the voyage that ended on Diamond Shoals had a beginning and a middle and a series of specific events along the way that matter very much to understanding what might have happened at the end. She was built in 1919 at a shipyard in Bath, Maine, by the G.G. Deering Company. She was named after the son of the ship's owner, a man named William Deering. 5 masts, 255 feet long, a commercial schooner designed for bulk cargo, primarily coal, the kind of vessel that made its living moving heavy goods up and down the eastern seaboard and into the Atlantic trade routes. She was not glamorous. She was a working ship, built to carry things from one place to another efficiently and reliably. And for the first year of her life, that is more or less what she did. Her final voyage began in the autumn of 1920. The plan was straightforward enough. Carry a load of coal from Norfolk, Virginia down to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and then return north empty. A long voyage, but not an unusual one for a ship of her type. She departed in September of 1920 with a crew of 11 men and a captain who, as it turned out, would not make it past the first leg of the journey. The original captain assigned to the Deering was a man named William Merritt. He fell ill in Portland, Maine, before the voyage had properly begun and had to be replaced. The man who took over was Captain Willis Warmel, 66 years old, experienced, a man who had spent much of his life at sea and who, by most accounts, knew what he was doing. He had a daughter named Lula, who was fond of him and who would later become one of the most determined and persistent private investigators this case ever had. But we'll come to Lula in time. What matters right now is that Captain Warmel took command of the Carroll A Deering for this voyage, and that somewhere between the autumn of 1920 and the morning of January 31st, 1921, something went very wrong. Something that left a ship grounded on Diamond Shoals with its meal still cooking and its crew nowhere to be found. The story of what that something might have been starts, really, not on the open ocean, but in a port, in a conversation, in a letter that Warmel wrote to his daughter from Barbados, expressing concern about his crew in terms that were specific enough and worried enough to matter quite a lot when investigators looked back at them later. Because even before the Deering left on the final leg of her return journey, there were signs that something aboard her was not right. The G.G. Deering Company shipyard in Bath, Maine, was not a small operation. Bath had been building ships for a long time by 1919. It sits on the Kennebec River, about 12 miles from where the river meets the sea, and the town had been a working shipyard town since the early 1800s. By the time the Carroll A Deering was laid down there, Bath was one of the most productive wooden shipbuilding centres left in the United States. The transition to steel hulls and steam engines had been underway for decades, but there was still a market for large commercial schooners, especially for bulk cargo work along the coast and into the Atlantic. They were cheaper to build than steamships, cheaper to operate, and for certain kinds of cargo, coal, lumber, grain, they were practical and reliable. The Deering was built for exactly that kind of work. She was launched in 1919, 255 feet from bow to stern, 5 masts, which made her an impressive sight on the water. Not many 5-masted schooners were still being built by that point, and the ones that existed tended to draw attention. Her hull was wooden, as was common for commercial schooners of her era. She was rigged for fore and aft sailing, meaning her sails ran lengthwise along the ship rather than across it, which made her easier to handle with a smaller crew than a square-rigged vessel of comparable size. That mattered, because a ship of 255 feet crewed by 11 men was already running lean. There was not a lot of room for error and not a lot of spare hands if something went wrong. William Deering, the ship's owner, named her after his son Carroll. That is a fairly common thing in maritime history, naming a vessel after a family member. but it is worth noting because it makes the ship feel personal in a way that matters later. This was not a corporate vessel with an anonymous name. It was named after someone's child. And when the ship disappeared with 11 men aboard, William Deering was among those who wanted answers, for reasons that were both professional and deeply human. The cargo on the final voyage was coal. She loaded at Norfolk, Virginia, which was one of the major coal shipping ports on the eastern seaboard. The plan was to carry the coal south to Rio de Janeiro, deliver it, and then return north in ballast, meaning empty or nearly so, which was standard practice for bulk cargo ships making that kind of run. The round trip was long. Norfolk to Rio de Janeiro is roughly 4,700 miles one way, and the return journey would bring the ship back up through the Caribbean and along the eastern seaboard. Months at sea, multiple ports, long stretches of open ocean with nothing to look at but water and sky. The voyage began in September of 1920, and the first complication arrived almost immediately. Captain William Merritt, who had been assigned to command the Deering for this voyage, fell ill while the ship was still in Portland, Maine, preparing for departure. The nature of his illness is not entirely clear from the historical record, but it was serious enough that he could not continue, and a replacement had to be found quickly. The replacement was Willis Wormel. Wormel was 66 years old when he took command of the Carroll A. Deering. He had been sailing for most of his adult life and had commanded ships before. By the standards of the time, he was an experienced mariner, the kind of man you would expect to handle a long Atlantic voyage without particular difficulty. But 66 was not young, and some people who knew him suggested that he had perhaps passed the peak of his abilities. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious on paper, but in the quieter ways that age sometimes works on a person. He was reportedly a bit slower, a bit less sharp in certain situations, though accounts vary on how significant this actually was. His daughter Lula, who knew him better than most, seems to have believed he was still capable, but there were others who had their doubts. What is not in doubt is that Wormel took the job, and that he and the crew of 11 departed on the voyage south. The outbound leg appears to have gone reasonably well. The Deering reached Rio de Janeiro, delivered the coal, and began the return journey north. It was on the return leg that things began, quietly, to go wrong. The ship stopped in Barbados in early 1921, January specifically, on the return passage north. Barbados was a common stop for ships making that Atlantic run, a place to take on supplies, let the crew go ashore for a day or two, handle any minor repairs. It was routine. But what happened in Barbados was not entirely routine, and it matters quite a bit to everything that came after. Wormel went ashore in Barbados, and while he was ashore, he did two things that became significant pieces of evidence later. First, he wrote a letter to his daughter Lula. Second, he had a conversation with a tugboat captain named Hugh Norton. The letter to Lula is the more important of the two in some ways, because it is the most direct record we have of Wormel's own state of mind at that point in the voyage. In the letter, Wormel expressed concern about his first mate. The first mate of the Carroll A. Deering was a man named Herbert Bates, and Wormel's description of Bates in that letter was not flattering. He described Bates as troublesome. He expressed worry about Bates's attitude and about the discipline of the crew more broadly. The exact wording of the letter has been discussed and analysed by investigators, and while the tone varies somewhat depending on which account you read, the basic message is consistent. Wormel was worried. He felt that something was wrong with the dynamic aboard his ship, and he was writing to his daughter about it from a port in Barbados, because apparently he felt the need to tell someone. That is worth sitting with for a moment. A 66-year-old sea captain, experienced enough to have commanded ships for decades, writing to his daughter from a Caribbean port to tell her he was concerned about his first mate. That is not a casual thing to do. Sailors of that era did not typically write home to express vague unease. If Wormel was worried enough to put it in a letter, he was probably more worried than the letter itself conveys. The conversation with Hugh Norton adds another layer. Norton was a tugboat captain who encountered Wormel in Barbados, and he later recalled that Wormel seemed distressed during their conversation. Norton's account, as reported in subsequent investigations, suggested that Wormel was not his usual self, that he seemed burdened by something, preoccupied, not at ease the way a captain returning from a successful cargo run might reasonably be. Norton did not record the specifics of what Wormel said to him, or if he did, those specifics have not survived in a form that historians can directly quote. But the general impression Norton left was that Wormel was a man dealing with something difficult aboard his ship. Now, Herbert Bates. It is worth being careful here, because Bates was never proven to have done anything wrong, and he disappeared along with everyone else, which means he is both a potential suspect and a potential victim. Those two things can be true at the same time, but the picture that emerges of Bates from the available accounts is of a man who was difficult to work with, strong-willed, possibly aggressive, someone who did not naturally defer to authority in the way that maritime hierarchy expected. Whether that made him dangerous or simply unpleasant to manage is something we genuinely do not know. What we know is that Wormel was worried about him, and that Wormel expressed that worry in writing, and that the letter survived to become part of the historical record. The crew of 11 aboard the Deering were not all American. The ship's manifest listed men of various backgrounds, which was common for commercial schooners of the era. Shipping companies hired from wherever experienced sailors were available, and the Atlantic trade routes drew men from Scandinavia, the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. This detail becomes relevant later, when we get to the Cape Lookout encounter, because the crew member who spoke to the lightship keeper there was noted specifically for speaking with a foreign accent. But that comes in a moment. What matters right now is the picture of the ship as it left Barbados in January 1921 and headed north. A five-masted schooner, 255 feet long, 11 men aboard, carrying nothing but ballast on the return leg. A captain in his 60s who was worried about his first mate. A first mate whose character had been described in writing as troublesome and potentially dangerous. A crew of mixed backgrounds and, apparently, mixed loyalty to the command structure, and ahead of them, the long stretch of the Atlantic coast, the outer banks of North Carolina and Diamond Shoals. The Deering's route north would have taken her along a well-travelled stretch of the eastern seaboard, past the Bahamas, up through the waters off the Carolinas. Cape Hatteras sits roughly in the middle of the North Carolina coast, and the waters around it have been dangerous for as long as ships have been sailing them. The shoals extend far out from the shore, the currents are unpredictable, and the weather can change with very little warning. More than 1,000 ships have gone down in those waters over the centuries, which is why the area earned its name, the Graveyard of the Atlantic. For a ship heading north in January, passing Cape Hatteras was not something you did carelessly. The Carroll A Deering was last seen under normal circumstances, or what appeared to be normal circumstances, in Barbados. After that, the timeline gets thin. There are a few days of open ocean with no recorded sightings, which was not unusual. Ships in 1921 did not have GPS or satellite communication. They had radio, but not all ships used it consistently, and the Deering's radio situation is itself a small complication in the story. What we know is that by late January, the ship was approaching the North Carolina coast, and on January 28th, 1921, she was spotted. The Cape Lookout lightship was anchored off the North Carolina coast, roughly 60 miles south of Cape Hatteras, serving as a navigational marker for ships passing through the area. On January 28th, the Carroll A Deering came within hailing distance of the lightship, and someone aboard called out to the lightship crew. That in itself was not unusual. Ships sometimes hailed lightships to report their position or pass along messages. What was unusual was who was doing the hailing. It was not Captain Wormel. It was not Herbert Bates, the first mate. It was a crew member, a lower-ranking sailor, who hailed the lightship and delivered a message, and the message he delivered was not reassuring. He reported that the Carroll A Deering had lost both of her anchors. He said this in a matter-of-fact way, apparently, but losing both anchors on a ship is not a minor thing. Anchors are not small pieces of equipment. They do not simply fall off. Losing one anchor is unusual. Losing both suggests something had gone significantly wrong, either through accident or through deliberate action. The lightship keeper, Thomas Jacobson, noted the encounter. He also noted that the man who hailed the lightship spoke with a foreign accent and had reddish hair. Jacobson tried to radio this information to the coast, the report of a ship in distress, or at least a ship with a significant problem. But his own radio was broken that day. The report could not be sent. And the Carroll A Deering continued north. 3 days later, she was on Diamond Shoals, empty. There is one more detail from those final days that deserves attention before we get to the discovery itself. On January 29th, the day after the Cape Lookout encounter, another ship was seen in the area near the Deering, a ship that was running without lights, a ship that did not respond to signals, a ship that was simply there, in the darkness, moving without identifying itself. Who that ship was, where it came from and where it went, those questions were never answered. But the presence of an unlit, unresponsive vessel in the vicinity of the Carroll A Deering in the final hours before she was found abandoned is one of the details that investigators kept returning to, because it is the kind of detail that does not fit neatly into any of the simple explanations. By January 31st, the Deering was aground on Diamond Shoals. The crew of the Cape Hatteras lightship spotted her, and what they saw was a ship that looked, from a distance, as if it might simply be in trouble, a vessel caught on a shoal waiting for help. But as they looked more closely, as they tried to raise someone aboard and received no response, as the hours passed and no one appeared on deck, the situation began to feel different. The sails were still set. The ship was not damaged in any obvious way, and there was no one there, no captain, no first mate, no 11 men, just a ship sitting on a shoal with something cooking in the galley below. That is where the rescuers found her, and what they found when they finally got aboard, which took several more days because the weather around Diamond Shoals does not cooperate simply because you need it to, is the part of this story that has never stopped asking questions of the people who hear it. Willis Wormel had been going to sea for most of his adult life. By the time he took command of the Carroll A, Deering in 1920, he was 66 years old, and the sea was simply what his life had been made of. Not a passion exactly, not a romance, just the work he knew and the world he understood. He had captained ships before. He had the experience and the credentials, but there were people who knew him who would say quietly that he was perhaps not quite the man he had once been. Not dramatically diminished, not incompetent, but older, a little slower, and perhaps less suited to managing a difficult crew than he might have been 10 or 15 years earlier. That is a delicate thing to say about someone, and it is worth being careful about it, because the people who described Wormel this way were doing so after the fact, with the benefit of knowing things had gone wrong. It is always easier to see the cracks in something once it is broken. What we do know concretely is what Wormel himself wrote. From Barbados, in late January 1921, he sent a letter to his daughter Lula. He wrote to her regularly when he was at sea, which was itself a kind of tenderness. A man in his 60s, writing home to his daughter from port cities along the Atlantic. The letters were ordinary in most respects, the kind of correspondence a seaman sends when he has a few hours ashore and wants to stay connected to the life waiting for him at home. But the letter from Barbados was different. In it, Wormel expressed concern about his first mate, Herbert Bates. He described Bates in terms that were, for a man of Wormel's generation and professional temperament, quite strong, troublesome, possibly dangerous. He was worried about the crew's discipline, worried about Bates's influence over the men, and worried, in a general way, that things aboard the Deering were not as they should be. That letter is one of the most important pieces of evidence in this entire case. Not because it proves anything, but because it is the captain's own voice, in his own hand, expressing fear about the situation on his ship while the ship was still in port. He had time to write the letter, he had time to go ashore, but he did not apparently take steps to resolve the problem in any formal way. did not report Bates to port authorities, didn't request a crew change, did not delay the departure. Whether that was because he felt he could handle it, or because he did not want to make a fuss, or because he simply did not know what to do, we cannot say. The letter exists. The action that might have followed from it does not. Herbert Bates is a figure who is difficult to fully see from this distance. The historical record gives us his name, his role as first mate, and the impressions of people who encountered him. But those impressions are fragmentary and filtered through the lens of what came after. What we know is that Wormel found him troublesome enough to write about it to his daughter. What we know is that Bates was described, in some accounts, as a man who had a difficult relationship with authority, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in the quieter, more persistent way of someone who resents being told what to do and lets that resentment simmer. On a ship, that kind of personality can be manageable, or it can become something else entirely, depending on how long the voyage is and how much pressure builds. The crew itself was 11 men in total, and most of them are known to us only by name. They came from various backgrounds, as ship's crews in that era typically did, a mix of nationalities, experiences, and reasons for being at sea. Some were experienced sailors, some were less so. The Deering was a commercial working vessel, not a naval ship with strict hierarchy and formal discipline, and working schooners in the early 20th century often had crews that were assembled quickly and held together by the practical necessities of the voyage rather than by any deep loyalty to the captain or the ship. 11 men, a 255-foot vessel, a long return leg from Rio de Janeiro to the American East Coast, carrying nothing but ballast. Plenty of time for tensions to develop, for grievances to accumulate, for small conflicts to grow larger in the close quarters of a working ship. Wormel was seen ashore in Barbados during the ship's stop there. He was not simply resting or attending to cargo business. He was, by some accounts, drinking. A tugboat captain named Hugh Norton later recalled meeting Wormel in Barbados and described the encounter in terms that suggested Wormel was not in good spirits. Distressed was the word some accounts used. Complaining about his crew, about Bates specifically, about the difficulty of maintaining order aboard the Deering. Norton's recollection was gathered after the fact, which means it carries the usual caveats about memory and retrospective interpretation, but it aligns with what Wormel himself put in writing to Lula. Whatever was happening aboard the Deering, it was not invisible. People could see it. Wormel was not hiding his concern. He was expressing it in letters home and in conversations with other mariners in port. What is harder to determine is the exact nature of the conflict. Was Bates simply difficult to manage? Argumentative, insubordinate in small ways, the kind of first mate who makes a captain's life harder without crossing any clear line? Or was the situation more serious than that? Wormel's letter used the word dangerous, which is a word a man chooses carefully when he's writing to his daughter. He was not prone to exaggeration as far as anyone could tell. He was a practical man of the sea, not a melodramatic one. If he wrote that his first mate might be dangerous, he likely meant something specific by it. Lula Wormel, for her part, took her father's concern very seriously. She would later become one of the most persistent private investigators of the Carroll A Deering case. Not a professional investigator, not someone with institutional resources, but a daughter who wanted to know what had happened to her father and who refused to simply accept the silence that followed. She wrote letters, she made inquiries, she interviewed people, she pushed the State Department and the Bureau of Navigation and members of Congress for information and answers. She was, by any measure, a tenacious and careful person, and her focus on Herbert Bates as a central figure in whatever happened was not simply grief looking for a villain. It was grounded in her father's own words. The trouble with Bates as a suspect, and this is something that any honest examination of the case has to acknowledge, is that he was never found. None of the crew was ever found. If there was a mutiny, if Bates led the crew against Wormel and the officers, then the question of what happened next remains entirely open. Where did 11 men go? Where did they take the lifeboats? The sea off the Carolinas in January is cold, and not particularly forgiving, but it is not impossible to survive in a lifeboat for a period of time, especially if the weather was relatively calm, and the weather on January 31st, when the Deering was found, was apparently calm enough that the ship's grounding on Diamond Shoals was not the result of a violent storm. So the lifeboats could have been launched. They could have made it somewhere, but no one ever turned up. No crew member was ever identified in any port. No one confessed, not even years later. That is a remarkable silence for 11 people to maintain. There is another layer to the crew question that is easy to overlook. The man who hailed the Cape Lookout lightship on January 28th, the one with the reddish hair and the foreign accent, the one who was not the captain and not the first mate, was never definitively identified. Thomas Jacobson, the lightship keeper, described him clearly enough that the description was recorded, but matching that description to any specific crew member from the Deering's manifest was never accomplished with certainty. The fact that it was a lower-ranking crew member doing the hailing, rather than the captain or the first mate, was unusual. On a well-functioning ship, that kind of communication with a lightship would typically be handled by the captain himself, or at least by an officer. The fact that it was not suggests that by January 28th, the normal command structure of the Deering was either breaking down or had already broken down. Some investigators read this as evidence that Wormel was already incapacitated by that point, possibly dead, possibly confined below decks. Others suggested that Wormel might have simply been ill, or that the hailing was done by a crew member at the captain's direction for some practical reason that had nothing sinister about it. Without knowing who the man was, it is impossible to say with confidence, but the detail sticks. It is the kind of small, specific irregularity that is easy to explain away individually, and harder to explain away when it sits alongside all the other irregularities. What the Cape Lookout encounter does establish clearly is that the Carroll A Deering was already in a compromised state by January 28th. Both anchors gone, a crew member speaking for the captain, a lightship keeper who tried to report the situation and couldn't because his radio was broken. It is one of those moments where a small mechanical failure, a broken radio on a lightship, might have made an enormous difference. If Jacobson had been able to get his message through, if the Coast Guard or another vessel had been alerted to the Deering's situation in time, perhaps someone would have reached the ship before whatever happened next had a chance to happen. But the radio was broken. The message did not go out, and the Deering continued north. By the time she was found on Diamond Shoals 3 days later, the question of what had been happening aboard her for those final days was already unanswerable. Whatever had occurred, whether it was a confrontation between the captain and the crew, a forced takeover, a sudden departure under duress, or something else entirely, it had happened somewhere out on the open water, out of sight of any witness, in the gap between the Cape Lookout sighting and the Diamond Shoals grounding. That gap is only 3 days long, but in 3 days at sea, a great deal can happen, and none of it leaves a record unless someone survives to write it down. The picture that emerges from all of this, from Wormel's letter, from the Barbados accounts, from the Cape Lookout encounter, is of a ship that was already troubled before it reached the waters off North Carolina. The trouble had a name, or at least a partial name, Herbert Bates. It had a shape, a captain who was worried, a first mate who was difficult, a crew whose loyalty was uncertain. It had a timeline. Things were not right in Barbados, and they were still not right, or possibly worse, by the time the ship passed Cape Lookout. And then, somewhere in the waters between Cape Lookout and Diamond Shoals, the story ends. Not with a resolution, but with a silence. 11 people, a 255-foot ship, a meal cooking in the galley, and then nothing. No voices, no explanation. Just the ship sitting on the shoal waiting for someone to come and ask questions that it could not answer. It is that silence that investigators kept running into no matter which direction they approached from. And the next place they looked for answers was in the physical evidence itself, in what the ship contained when the boarding party finally got aboard. and in what that evidence suggested about the final moments of the Carroll A. Deering's crew. The Carroll A. Deering passed Cape Lookout on January 28, 1921. That much is certain. Thomas Jacobson, the keeper of the Cape Lookout lightship, recorded the encounter. He noted the time, he noted the ship, and he noted the strange detail of the crew member who hailed them. The man with reddish hair, speaking with an accent that Jacobson could not quite place, delivering a message that the ship had lost both anchors. That detail about the anchors was important, not because losing an anchor is catastrophic on its own, but because the Deering had reportedly lost both of them. 2 anchors. That is not an accident that happens in a single moment. It suggests something more extended, more complicated, a period of rough weather or a dragging situation that went on long enough to lose both chains, or perhaps something else that no one has ever been able to explain with confidence. Jacobson tried to radio the report. He wanted to alert someone, the Coast Guard, another vessel, anyone who might be able to assist or at least take note of a 5-masted schooner running without her anchors in waters that had claimed more than 1,000 ships before her. But his radio was broken. The message stayed with him, on the lightship, going nowhere. He logged it. He watched the Deering continue north. And that was the last time anyone with a name and a recorded account saw the Carroll A. Deering with any kind of certainty. What is strange about the Cape Lookout encounter, and it is strange the more you sit with it, is not just the lost anchors, it is the man doing the talking. On a functioning ship in 1921, communication with a lightship would typically be handled by the captain or by an officer. That was simply how things were done. The captain was the face of the ship in formal interactions, and hailing a lightship to report a problem was exactly the kind of moment where you would expect to see Captain Willis Warmel at the rail. Instead, it was someone else, a crew member, a man Jacobson described as having reddish hair and a foreign accent, neither of which matched the description of Warmel or of Herbert Bates, the first mate. Whoever this man was, he was not in the command structure that would ordinarily have handled this kind of communication. Some investigators suggested that Warmel might simply have been ill and that a crew member was relaying the message on his behalf. That is possible. Warmel was 66 years old, and the accounts from Barbados suggested he'd been drinking and was not in the best condition. A sick captain might reasonably send a crew member to handle a brief hailing, but it is also possible, and the evidence does not rule this out, that by January 28th, Warmel was no longer in a position to speak for himself at all. That is a darker reading, and it is not proven, but it is consistent with what the physical evidence aboard the ship would later suggest about the state of command in those final days. The Deering continued north after the Cape Lookout sighting. January 28th became January 29th, and on January 29th, something else happened. Another ship was seen in the vicinity of the Deering, a vessel that was running without lights. This is the detail that investigators kept returning to, because it is genuinely difficult to explain away. A ship running without lights at night, in waters that were not particularly remote, in an era when maritime signalling was both a legal requirement and a practical safety measure. That is a ship that did not want to be seen. The identity of this vessel was never established. No one came forward to claim it. No log from another ship in the area recorded its own presence, or the presence of the Deering nearby. It simply appeared in the historical record as a shadow, something that was there, or seemed to be there, and then was gone. The lightship at Cape Lookout had seen the Deering. The mystery ship had apparently been near the Deering on the 29th, and then, on January 31st, the Deering was found grounded on Diamond Shoals, empty, with the galley stove still burning. The timeline of those 3 days, the 28th, the 29th, the 30th, and into the morning of the 31st, is where the mystery lives. Everything that investigators later argued about, every theory and counter-theory, every piece of evidence and its interpretation, ultimately comes back to what happened in that window of time. The Cape Lookout sighting is the last fixed point. After that, there is only the ship itself, and what it contained and what it did not contain. The Coast Guard cutter Seminole was the first vessel to reach the grounded Deering after she was spotted on January 31st. But the weather off Diamond Shoals that day was rough enough that boarding was not immediately possible. The Deering sat on the shoal for days while the weather made access difficult. The cutter Acushnet also attempted to reach her. It was not until February 4th, 4 days after the initial sighting, that a boarding party was finally able to get alongside and climb aboard. Those 4 days matter in a quiet way. Whatever condition the ship was in when she grounded on the 31st, she'd been sitting exposed on Diamond Shoals for 4 days by the time anyone walked her decks. Weather, spray and time had all had their opportunity to alter the scene. This is worth keeping in mind when considering the physical evidence, not because it invalidates it, but because it adds a layer of uncertainty to some of the finer details. What was found on February 4th was what remained after 4 days of exposure on one of the most treacherous stretches of the American coastline. What the boarding party found has been described in various accounts, and the core details are consistent enough across sources to be treated as reliable. The ship was grounded but structurally intact. Her 5 masts were still standing. Her sails were still set, which was unusual for a ship at anchor or in distress. Normally you would furl the sails. The anchors were gone, consistent with what the crew member had told Jacobson at Cape Lookout. The lifeboats were missing from their davits. One lifeboat was found damaged, trailing behind the ship on a line, waterlogged and unusable. The other lifeboats were simply gone. The steering gear had been smashed. This is one of the most significant details in the entire case, and it is worth pausing on. The binnacle, the housing that contains the ship's compass, was destroyed. The steering mechanism itself was disabled, and the word that investigators used and that the physical evidence supported was not damaged. It was smashed, deliberately put out of action. Weather does not smash a steering mechanism in a way that looks deliberate. A rogue wave does not selectively destroy the binnacle while leaving the masts intact. Whatever happened to the Deering's steering gear, it was done by a person, with intent. The ship's log was missing, the navigation charts and papers were gone. The captain's quarters had been gone through, belongings left behind, but the official documents absent. The same was true of the officers' quarters. Personal items remained, which is one of the details that makes a planned departure seem unlikely. If you are leaving a ship voluntarily, with time to think, you take your personal belongings. The crew of the Deering left behind the kinds of things that people take with them when they have a moment to pack. Whatever happened, it did not allow for that kind of deliberate preparation. And then there was the galley. The galley stove was still burning when the boarding party arrived on February 4th. That detail has been repeated so many times in accounts of the Deering that it risks becoming a kind of legend, something you hear so often that it starts to feel like a metaphor rather than a fact. But it was a fact. The stove was burning, food was being prepared. A pot of pork and beans was on the stove. There was coffee. There were other provisions in various stages of preparation, enough food being made for the whole crew, not for 1 or 2 people having a quiet meal, but for 11 men sitting down together. The meal had been started. It had not been finished. Whoever lit that stove and put those pots on the heat did not come back to eat what they had made. There is something about that image that resists easy analysis. If the crew was swept overboard by a sudden wave or a water spout, they would not have had time to light the stove and start a meal. If they abandoned ship in a panic, the stove suggests they were not panicking when they last went into the galley. If they were taken by force, the meal suggests the force came while they were in the middle of their ordinary day, doing the ordinary thing of preparing food. The galley is the most human detail in the entire story, and it is also the most unsettling, precisely because it is so ordinary. Pork and beans, coffee, a meal for 11 people who never sat down to eat it. The red distress lights that had been set aboard the ship were another detail the boarding party noted. Someone had placed distress signals. That is not something you do accidentally, and it is not something a crew does if they have simply decided to abandon ship for reasons of their own. You set distress signals when you want to be found, when you want help, when you're in trouble and hoping that someone will see the light and come. The lights had been set, someone had wanted to be found, and then they were gone. The picture that all of this creates is of a ship in crisis, not a ship that was quietly abandoned, not a ship where 11 men made a calm decision to leave together, but a ship where something happened suddenly, or under duress, in the middle of an ordinary day. The food on the stove, the distress signals set, the steering gear deliberately smashed, the papers and log removed, the lifeboats gone. These details do not add up to a simple story. They add up to a situation that was both urgent and deliberate, which is a combination that is hard to explain without human agency at the centre of it. The investigators who boarded the Deering and documented what they found were experienced enough to recognise that what they were looking at was not the aftermath of a natural disaster. A storm leaves different evidence. A rogue wave leaves different evidence. What the Deering showed was a ship that had been altered by human hands before it was abandoned. The steering gear smashed, the papers removed, the anchors gone, the lifeboats launched. Someone, or several someones, had made decisions aboard that ship. Those decisions had led to this: an empty vessel on a shoal, a meal on the stove, and no one left to explain any of it. The boarding party's report made its way up through the Coast Guard and into the hands of federal investigators, who would spend months and eventually years trying to make sense of what had been found. But before any of those larger investigations could begin in earnest, the immediate question was simply, where were the 11 men who had sailed the Carroll A Deering out of Barbados and up the Atlantic coast toward home? The ship had been found. The crew had not. And as the days after February 4th became weeks, and the weeks became months, the absence of any survivor, any witness, any confession, or any body began to define the case as clearly as any piece of physical evidence. The ship was the only thing that had come back. Everything human about the voyage had simply disappeared. What the federal investigators would soon discover was that the evidence aboard the Deering, as specific and strange as it was, raised more questions than it answered, and the scale of the response that followed, the number of agencies involved, the number of countries contacted, the sheer weight of official attention brought to bear on the disappearance of 11 sailors, would say something about just how seriously this case was taken, and how completely it defeated the people who tried to solve it. The agencies that would eventually take up the Carroll A Deering case were not small offices with limited resources. This was not a local investigation handled by a county sheriff and a few Coast Guard officers writing up a brief report. Within weeks of the boarding on February 4th, the case had moved upward through the federal government with a speed that reflected how genuinely strange and serious the situation appeared to those who first reviewed the evidence. But before any of that larger machinery could begin turning, the immediate days after the discovery had their own particular difficulty, and it started with the weather. The Coast Guard cutter Seminole had spotted the grounded Deering on January 31st, the same day the Cape Hatteras lightship crew first reported the vessel. The Seminole attempted to approach and board, but the conditions around Diamond Shoals made it impossible. Diamond Shoals is not a forgiving piece of geography. It extends roughly 14 miles off Cape Hatteras into the Atlantic, a submerged ridge of sand that shifts and builds in unpredictable ways depending on the season and the storms. Currents from the north and south converge there, the cold Labrador current pushing down from the Arctic and the warm Gulf Stream pushing up from the tropics, and where those two bodies of water meet, the sea behaves in ways that experienced sailors respect deeply. The shoals had been claiming ships for centuries before the Deering arrived, which is part of why the area around Cape Hatteras is sometimes called the graveyard of the Atlantic. So when the Seminole found the Deering hard aground on January 31st, the crew could see the ship clearly enough, could see the sail still set and the hull sitting wrong on the sand, but getting to her was another matter entirely. A second vessel, the cutter Acushnet, also attempted to reach the Deering in the days that followed, and it too was turned back by weather and sea conditions. It was not until February 4th, 4 days after the ship was first spotted, that a boarding party was finally able to reach the hull and climb aboard. 4 days is a long time when you're wondering whether there might be survivors still on a grounded ship. It is also a long time in terms of preserving evidence. The sea had been working on the Deering for those 4 days, and the weather that had kept rescuers away had also been pushing at the hull, the rigging, the deck, whatever had been left behind by whoever had last been aboard. Some of it may have shifted or been washed away in the time between discovery and boarding. That is worth keeping in mind when thinking about what the boarding party found, because what they found was already a partial picture. Some of the original scene had been altered by days of exposure before any human investigator set foot on the deck. What they did find, though, was more than enough to make the case strange. The anchors were gone, both of them, which is not a condition that results from ordinary grounding. An anchor does not simply fall off a ship. Losing one anchor in a severe storm is possible. Losing both, without any remaining evidence of catastrophic hull damage, points toward deliberate removal or deployment under unusual circumstances. The Cape Lookout lightship encounter on January 28th had already established that the crew reported losing their anchors before the grounding, which suggests the anchors were gone before the ship ever hit the shoals. Whether they were lost in an attempt to stop the ship, or deployed and then cut free, or removed for some other reason, the boarding party found no anchors and no clear explanation for their absence. The lifeboats were gone from their davits. This is significant because it means the crew had a means of leaving the ship, and they used it, or someone used it. One lifeboat was found trailing behind the Deering on a line, damaged, dragging in the water. That single damaged boat suggested that not all the lifeboats had made it away cleanly. Whether the boat had been damaged during a hurried launch, or struck something in the water, or been damaged before it was ever put over the side, no one could say with certainty. But the fact that the davits were empty, and one boat was found trailing behind, tells you that at some point people had been getting off the ship, or being put off the ship. The distinction matters enormously, and the evidence did not settle it. The steering gear was what most clearly indicated human intention rather than natural accident. The binnacle, which is the housing that holds the compass and related steering instruments, had been destroyed. The steering mechanism itself was disabled and smashed in a way that the boarding party and subsequent investigators described as deliberate. This is not the kind of damage that a storm produces. A storm can damage rigging, can crack a hull, can sweep things from a deck, can overwhelm a crew. A storm does not selectively smash the steering gear while leaving the rest of the ship structurally sound. The hull of the Deering, when it was later inspected more thoroughly, was found to be in reasonably good condition. The ship had not been through a catastrophic structural event. The damage to the steering gear was targeted, specific and intentional. Someone had made sure the ship could not be steered. Why you would disable a ship's steering gear is a question that points in a few directions, none of them comfortable. If you are abandoning a ship and you want to prevent someone from following you, or you want to prevent the ship from being easily recovered, you might disable the steering. If you are taking control of a ship by force and you want to ensure that whoever remains aboard cannot maneuver it, you might disable the steering. If you want to ensure that a ship runs aground and is lost, disabling the steering is a way to accomplish that. Each of these possibilities implies a different scenario, but all of them imply deliberate human action. The smashed steering gear is one of the details that most firmly separates the Carroll A Deering from the category of maritime accident. The captain's quarters and the officers' quarters had been gone through. Personal belongings were still present, which, as noted before, is one of the stranger aspects of the scene, because people who are leaving voluntarily tend to take their personal things. What was missing from those quarters was the official material. The ship's log was gone. The navigation equipment was gone. The ship's papers, the documents that establish a vessel's identity, its cargo records, its official business, were absent. Someone had removed the things that would tell the story of the voyage, the official record of where the ship had been and what had happened aboard. Personal items left behind, official documents taken away. That is a specific kind of selective removal that suggests whoever took those papers knew what they were looking for and why those particular items mattered. And then the boarding party walked into the galley and found the stove still burning and the food still on the heat. It is worth sitting with that detail for a moment longer, not because it has not been mentioned before, but because in the context of everything else the boarding party found that day, the galley is the part of the scene that most resists easy categorization. The smashed steering gear is evidence of deliberate action. The missing papers are evidence of deliberate removal. The empty davits are evidence that someone left the ship by lifeboat. These are all pieces of evidence that point toward human decisions made under some kind of pressure or intention. But the food on the stove is different. The food on the stove is evidence of an ordinary moment, of someone doing the most routine possible thing, preparing a meal right up until whatever happened happened. The pork and beans were there, the coffee was there, enough food had been put on to feed all 11 men. The cook, or whoever had been in the galley that day, had been doing their job, and then they had not come back. The red distress signals that had been set aboard the ship added another layer to the picture. Setting distress signals is a deliberate act. You do not accidentally put out distress lights. Someone aboard the Deering, at some point before the ship grounded on Diamond Shoals, had made the decision to signal for help. That decision takes time and intention. It means that at least one person aboard was in a situation where they believed they needed rescue, and they had taken the step of trying to communicate that need. The lights had been set. The ship had been asking for help. No help had come in time, or if it had come too late to find anyone still aboard. The boarding party documented all of this carefully. Their report described the physical state of the ship in the kind of methodical detail that official investigations produce, and that report became the foundation of everything that followed. But even in its careful, factual language, the report could not explain what had happened. It could only describe what had been left behind. And what had been left behind was, in the words of at least one investigator who reviewed the findings, unlike anything he had encountered in his years of maritime work. Not because ships had never been abandoned before, and not because crews had never disappeared, but because the specific combination of evidence aboard the Deering did not fit any single clean explanation. It required something more complicated than a storm, more organised than a panic, more deliberate than an accident. The Deering herself remained on Diamond Shoals for several weeks after the boarding. The sea conditions that had made the initial approach so difficult continued to complicate efforts to remove the vessel. She sat there, hard aground, the mystery of her empty decks known to Coast Guard officers and federal officials but not yet widely reported to the public. That would change. The story would eventually reach newspapers, and when it did, the image of the grounded five-masted schooner with food still cooking on the stove would capture public imagination in a way that the investigators had perhaps not anticipated. But in those first weeks of February 1921, the case was still primarily in official hands, and the officials were trying to figure out what they were dealing with. What they were dealing with, as they reviewed the boarding party's report and considered the earlier accounts from the Cape Lookout lightship, and the reports of the unlit ship seen nearby, was a situation that seemed to demand a human explanation. The evidence was too specific, too selective, too deliberate in its particulars to be explained by the sea alone. 11 men had been aboard the Carroll A Deering when she left Barbados. 11 men had presumably been aboard when she passed Cape Lookout on January 28th, though only one had been seen and heard. By the time she grounded on Diamond Shoals 3 days later, those 11 men were gone, and everything they had left behind told a story that no one could quite read clearly enough to understand. The investigators who would soon take up the case in earnest, the federal agents and department officials who would spend months corresponding with foreign governments and interviewing dock workers and sailors and anyone who had ever had contact with the ship, would find that the evidence from the boarding party was both the most concrete thing they had to work with and, in some ways, the most frustrating. Concrete because it was real, documented, physical. Frustrating because it was incomplete. The scene inside the Deering was a sentence that had been started and never finished. A story interrupted before it could reach its ending. The food on the stove, the smashed steering gear, the missing log, the empty davits, the distress signals set and unanswered. All of it pointed towards something. None of it pointed clearly enough to tell you exactly what that something was, and so the investigation would have to go looking for answers in the places the evidence itself could not reach. In the conversations that had happened in Barbados before the ship left port, in the identity of the unlit vessel seen near the Deering on January 29th, in the character and history of the men who had been aboard, in the letters that had been written and the accounts that had been given by the few people who had seen or spoken to anyone connected to the ship in its final days. The boarding party had found the physical scene. What came next was the attempt to understand it, and that attempt would draw in some of the most senior officials in the American government, reach across more than a dozen countries, and still come back, in the end, without a satisfying answer. The investigation that followed the discovery of the Carroll A. Deering was, in its own way, almost as remarkable as the mystery itself, and that investigation, when it came, was not a small thing. This was not a local inquiry handled by a regional Coast Guard office and then quietly filed away. The Carroll A. Deering case, within weeks of the ship being boarded, had attracted the attention of multiple branches of the United States federal government simultaneously, and the scale of the official response that followed was, by almost any measure, extraordinary for a missing crew case. It speaks to how genuinely puzzling the evidence was that so many serious people in serious positions took it as seriously as they did. The State Department became involved early. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, who was at the time one of the most prominent figures in American public life, personally oversaw correspondence related to the case. Hughes had been a Supreme Court justice, a former presidential candidate, and would later serve as Chief Justice of the United States. He was not a man who spent his attention carelessly. The fact that his name appears in the official correspondence surrounding the Carroll A. Deering gives you some sense of how far up the chain of concern this case travelled. Letters went out under his department's authority to foreign governments across more than a dozen countries, asking whether any ships had reported unusual sightings, whether any survivors or bodies had been found, whether any vessels had behaved strangely in the relevant waters in late January 1921. The replies, when they came, offered nothing useful. The Department of Commerce was involved as well. Herbert Hoover was then serving as Secretary of Commerce, and a special agent named Lawrence Ritchie, working under Hoover's authority, was assigned to conduct a formal investigation into the disappearance. Ritchie was not a maritime specialist by training, but he was a thorough and methodical investigator, and the work he produced was careful and detailed. He interviewed witnesses, he reviewed the boarding party's findings, he traced the ship's movements through the ports it had visited. He corresponded with dock workers, harbour officials, and anyone who had had direct contact with the Deering or its crew during the final voyage. His investigation ran for months and generated a substantial paper trail, much of which has survived in the historical record and still makes for genuinely absorbing reading if you have the patience to work through it. The Bureau of Navigation was also part of the official effort, as was the Navy, which contributed resources and expertise to the search for any trace of the missing crew. More than 2,000 ships were formally asked to watch for survivors, for bodies, for wreckage, for any sign that 11 men had made it off the Deering and onto something else. The Atlantic is a large place, and the search was necessarily imperfect, but the breadth of it was real. 2,000 vessels asked to keep watch. Ports across the Caribbean, South America, and the eastern seaboard alerted to the possibility that someone from the Deering might turn up. None of them did. What you have to appreciate about all of this is that the investigation was operating with a very specific and frustrating set of constraints. The physical evidence from the ship was already fixed. The boarding party had documented what was there, and the ship itself was still sitting on Diamond Shoals for the time being, largely inaccessible due to weather. The crew was gone with no trace. There were no witnesses to whatever had happened aboard the Deering on or around January 29th or 30th, 1921. No one who could say with certainty what had taken place in those final hours before the ship grounded. What the investigators had to work with were the events before the disappearance, the conversations in Barbados, the Cape Lookout encounter, the unlit ship, and the physical aftermath, which was suggestive but not conclusive. They were trying to reconstruct a story from its edges, from what had happened before and what had been left behind, without any access to the middle part, which was the part that actually mattered. Ritchie's investigation, despite its thoroughness, ran into this problem repeatedly. He could establish that something had gone wrong. He could document the evidence that pointed toward human action rather than natural disaster. He could note the deliberate disabling of the steering gear, the missing log and ship's papers, the empty davit fittings where the lifeboats had been secured. He could point to Wormel's letter from Barbados, expressing concern about the first mate. He could describe the strange encounter at Cape Lookout and the unusual fact of a lower crew member speaking for the captain. All of this was real and documented and troubling. But none of it told him what had actually happened, or where 11 people had gone, or whether they were dead or alive or somewhere in between. The Carroll A Deering herself was eventually removed from Diamond Shoals in March of 1921. Towed off the shoals after weeks of difficult sea conditions had delayed any attempt to move her. She was brought to Wilmington, North Carolina, where a more thorough physical inspection of the hull and interior could be conducted. That inspection confirmed what the boarding party had reported, and added some additional detail but produced no new answers. The hull itself was found to be structurally sound. There was no evidence of the kind of catastrophic damage you would expect if the ship had been through a violent storm severe enough to sweep 11 men overboard. The Deering had not been broken apart by the sea. She had been emptied of her crew by something else, and then she had drifted and grounded, and that was the extent of what the hull could tell you. After the Wilmington inspection, the Deering's fate was decided with a kind of blunt practicality that sits slightly uncomfortably against the scale of the mystery surrounding her. She was declared a hazard to navigation, towed out to sea and sunk. Dynamited in 1921, not long after the investigation had begun in earnest. The ship that had carried 11 men on their final voyage, the ship that had been found with food on the stove and lifeboats missing and steering gear smashed, was destroyed before the investigation that her disappearance had prompted had reached any kind of conclusion. There is something genuinely frustrating about that if you sit with it for a moment. The one physical object that contained the most direct evidence of what had happened was removed from the equation while investigators were still trying to understand what the evidence meant. Whether a more thorough or extended examination of the ship might have produced answers is impossible to say now. But the possibility was closed off permanently when the Deering went under. The official file on the Carroll A. Deering case grew to hundreds of pages. Correspondence with foreign governments, interview transcripts, reports from port authorities, analyses of the physical evidence, summaries of the various theories that investigators had considered and tested and found wanting. It is a substantial record of a serious effort, and it is also a record of a serious effort that produced in the end almost nothing in the way of conclusions. No charges were ever filed. No crew member was ever found alive. No body was ever definitively identified as belonging to a member of the Deering's crew. No one was ever arrested, questioned under oath, or brought before any kind of formal proceeding in connection with the disappearance. The investigation was not formally closed with a finding. It did not end with a declaration that the mystery had been solved, or that a particular explanation had been established as the most likely truth. It simply stopped. The correspondence slowed and then ceased. The file was archived. The case moved from the category of active investigation into the category of unresolved, and it stayed there. It is still there now, more than 100 years later, officially unresolved, with no conclusion on record. This outcome, the failure of a massive multi-department, multi-country federal investigation to produce any definitive answer, is itself one of the most striking things about the Carroll A. Deering case. You can understand a mystery remaining unsolved when the investigation is small, underfunded, conducted by people without the resources or authority to pursue it properly. The Deering case was not that. The full institutional weight of the United States government was brought to bear on it, at least for a period of months, and it still came back empty. That tells you something about the nature of the evidence, or rather the absence of it. Whatever happened to the crew of the Carroll A Deering happened in a place and in a way that left almost no recoverable trail. 11 people vanished from a ship in the Atlantic, and despite the efforts of the State Department, the Department of Commerce, the Navy, the Bureau of Navigation, and a special federal investigator working under the future President Herbert Hoover, no one could say where they'd gone. Lawrence Ritchie, to his credit, did not pretend otherwise. His final reports on the case are honest about the limits of what the investigation had been able to establish. He identified the most plausible explanations, noted the evidence that supported each, acknowledged the evidence that each explanation failed to account for, and concluded, essentially, that a definitive answer was not available. That is a hard thing to write in an official report. It is also, given the actual state of the evidence, the honest thing to write. Some cases do not resolve. Some investigations reach the edge of what is knowable, and find that the edge is closer than they had hoped. What Ritchie's investigation did accomplish, even without a conclusion, was to establish the factual record of the case with enough detail and credibility that later researchers and historians had something solid to work from. The interviews he conducted, the documents he gathered, the correspondence he generated, all of it became the foundation on which every subsequent attempt to understand the Deering's disappearance has been built. Without that work, the case would be far more obscure than it is, and the details we do know would be harder to verify. The investigation failed to solve the mystery, but it preserved it in enough detail that the mystery remained worth thinking about. There is a particular quality to unsolved cases that have been seriously investigated. They are different from mysteries that were never properly examined, where the absence of answers might reflect the absence of effort. The Carroll A Deering was not ignored. It was not dismissed. It was examined by serious people with real authority and genuine resources, and it still did not yield. That combination, the serious investigation, and the persistent absence of answers, is part of what gives the case its particular weight. It is not a mystery that survived because no one looked closely enough. It is a mystery that survived looking closely, and that is a different thing entirely. The public, when the story finally reached the newspapers in any sustained way, responded with the kind of fascinated attention that these cases tend to generate. The image of the abandoned ship, the food on the stove, the missing crew, was the kind of story that settled into public consciousness and stayed there. People had theories. Letters arrived at government offices from ordinary citizens who had read about the case and wanted to offer their explanations. Some of those letters were thoughtful, many were not. None of them provided the answer that the professional investigators had been unable to find. The theories themselves, the serious ones, the ones that had been developed by investigators with access to the actual evidence, were already taking shape during this period. Ritchie and others had been considering the possibilities from early in the investigation, weighing them against what the evidence supported and what it contradicted. Those theories would become the central debates of the case, the frameworks through which every subsequent discussion of the Deering would be organised. And the most persistent of them, the one that the evidence seemed most consistently to suggest, however imperfectly, was the possibility that something had gone wrong among the people aboard the ship itself, long before the Deering reached Diamond Shoals. The tension that Wormel had described in his letter from Barbados. The first mate he had called troublesome. The discipline problems he had mentioned were the kind of quiet alarm that, in retrospect, reads as more than routine complaint. The investigation had documented all of it, and the question of what had happened between those men, in the weeks between Barbados and the Carolina coast, was the question that kept pulling the inquiry back toward the human story at its centre, the mutiny theory. It is the one that most investigators return to, the one that the available evidence seemed to point toward more consistently than any other, and it deserves to be looked at carefully rather than simply accepted or dismissed, because it does explain certain things quite well. But it also leaves a particular and very large question sitting in the middle of it, unanswered, and that question matters. start with what Wormel himself said. His letter from Barbados, written to his daughter Lula during the ship's stop there on the return leg of the voyage, was not the letter of a man at ease. He described Herbert Bates, his first mate, in terms that were more than routine complaint. He used the word troublesome. He expressed concern about the crew's discipline in a way that, read now, carries a kind of quiet dread. Wormel was 66 years old, experienced, a man who had spent decades at sea. He was not someone who would have written that kind of letter without reason. He had been around enough ships and enough crews to know the difference between ordinary friction and something that felt genuinely worrying. And what he described to his daughter felt genuinely worrying. That letter is one of the most important documents in the entire case, not because it proves anything, but because it establishes that the conditions for serious conflict existed aboard the Carroll A before the ship ever left Barbados. Then there is the encounter at Cape Lookout on January 28th, 3 days before the ship was found on Diamond Shoals. The crew member who hailed the lightship, who spoke for the ship, who reported that the Deering had lost both anchors, was not the captain. He was not the first mate. He was a lower-ranking crew member, described as having reddish hair and speaking with what Thomas Jacobson, the lightship keeper, remembered as a foreign accent. This was unusual. When a ship hails a lightship to report a problem, the captain or a senior officer typically speaks. The fact that someone else was doing the speaking and doing it in a way that Jacobson apparently found notable enough to remember raises a reasonable question. Where was Wormel? Where was Bates? Why was this particular man speaking for the ship? One answer, the one that the mutiny theory offers, is that by January 28th, Wormel was no longer in command. That something had happened between Barbados and Cape Lookout, somewhere in those weeks at sea, that had changed the situation aboard the ship in a fundamental way. If the officers had been killed, or incapacitated, or confined below decks, then whoever was now running things would have had to speak to the lightship themselves. They would have had to explain the missing anchors somehow. They would have had to present a normal face to the outside world while managing whatever had actually happened aboard. The steering gear is another piece of the puzzle that the mutiny theory handles reasonably well. When investigators boarded the Deering on February 4th, they found the steering mechanism had been disabled. Not damaged by weather or collision, not worn out from use, but smashed, deliberately smashed, in a way that made clear someone had done it intentionally. A storm does not smash steering gear in that particular way. A rogue wave does not smash steering gear in that particular way. A person with a tool and a reason does. The question is what that reason might have been. One possibility is that whoever was aboard after the mutiny, if there was a mutiny, did not want the ship to be easily controlled or followed. Another is that the steering gear was destroyed as part of the chaos of whatever happened, in anger or in panic. Either way, the deliberate nature of the damage points toward human action rather than natural force, and human action with some kind of intent behind it. The ship's log was gone. The navigation equipment was gone. The ship's papers were gone. These are not things that wash overboard in a storm. They are things that people take or destroy when they do not want a record to survive. A ship's log is a legal document. It records positions, weather, incidents, orders given and received. If something had happened aboard the Deering that someone wanted to conceal, removing the log would be an obvious first step. The same logic applies to the navigation equipment and papers. You take those things when you're trying to make sure that whatever happened cannot be reconstructed from the official record. And then there is the food on the stove, the pork and beans, the coffee, the meal that had been prepared for the whole crew. This detail is usually discussed as evidence of sudden departure, of people who left in a hurry and did not have time to turn off the stove, and that is one way to read it. But it is also possible to read it differently. If a mutiny had occurred, and if the people who had taken control of the ship were themselves preparing to leave, they might have started a meal in the ordinary course of things, and then something happened that forced them to leave before they could eat it. The stove being lit does not tell us exactly when the crew left or under what circumstances. It tells us that someone intended to eat and then did not. That is all. The stove is a clue, but it is not a simple one. The case for mutiny, then, rests on several things. Wormel's own letter expressing fear of baits and concern about discipline, the unusual presence of a lower crew member speaking at Cape Lookout, the deliberate destruction of the steering gear, the removal of the log and papers, and the general picture of a ship that showed signs of human decision-making rather than natural catastrophe. Taken together, these things form a coherent, if incomplete, picture. They suggest that something happened among the people on that ship, that someone made choices that were violent or at least forceful, and that the result was a vessel left adrift and empty on the Carolina coast. But here is the question that the mutiny theory cannot answer, and it is not a small question. Where did they go? If 11 men were aboard the Carroll A, Deering when it passed Cape Lookout on January 28th, and if some of them mutinied against the officers, then at some point before January 31st, all 11 of them left the ship. The lifeboats were gone from their davits. One damaged lifeboat was found trailing behind the ship on a line, which suggests it had been used and then either abandoned or lost. The sea conditions on January 31st were not so severe that a lifeboat departure would have been suicidal. It is physically possible that people left the ship in the lifeboats in those days between Cape Lookout and the discovery on Diamond Shoals. But where did they go? No crew member of the Carroll A. Deering was ever found. Not one. Not alive, not dead, not in a lifeboat drifting somewhere, not washed ashore on the Carolina coast, not identified in any port or town. 11 people in 1921, along a coastline that was not uninhabited. If they had come ashore, someone would have seen them. If they had reached another ship, that ship's crew would have had something to say about it eventually. If they had drowned, at least some of the bodies, given the currents in that area and the relatively short distances involved, would likely have surfaced somewhere. None of them did. Not one of the 11 men who sailed on the Carroll A. Deering was ever accounted for after January 28th. This is the part of the mutiny theory that does not resolve. Mutiny explains why the ship was abandoned. It explains the smashed steering gear and the missing log. It offers a reason for the unusual communication at Cape Lookout. But it does not explain what happened to the people who mutinied. If Bates and some portion of the crew killed Wormel and the loyal officers, they still had to go somewhere. They still had to end up somewhere, and they did not. They vanished as completely as if they had never existed, which is a strange outcome for a mutiny that was otherwise apparently quite thorough in its execution. Some investigators have suggested that the mutineers may have been taken by the unlit ship that was spotted near the Deering on January 29th, the vessel that was seen running without lights, ignoring signals. If that ship was involved, it could have taken the crew, willing or otherwise, to somewhere that left no traceable record. A rum-running vessel perhaps, or some other operation that had reasons to stay invisible. That possibility connects the mutiny theory to the piracy theory in a way that is not entirely implausible. Maybe what happened was not purely one thing or the other. Maybe there was conflict aboard the Deering, and then there was an encounter with another vessel, and the two events are part of the same story rather than competing explanations. It is also worth noting that mutiny in the early 1920s was not as rare an occurrence as it might seem from this distance. Commercial sailing ships were a declining industry by that point. Steam-powered vessels were taking over the bulk cargo trade, and the men who still crewed large schooners were often working in difficult conditions for uncertain pay. Discipline problems were not unusual. Conflicts between captains and first mates were not unusual. Wormel's letter from Barbados, expressing concern about Bates, was unusual only in the degree of anxiety it seemed to carry, not in the basic situation it described. These were men in a demanding, sometimes brutal profession, at sea for months at a time, under conditions that tested even stable relationships. The idea that something broke down among them is not difficult to believe. What is difficult is the complete absence of any survivor. Mutinies, historically, tend to leave traces. People talk, people are seen. People surface somewhere eventually, even if they are trying not to. The crew of the Carroll A Deering did not. Whatever happened to them, whether they died at sea or were taken by another vessel or reached shore somewhere and disappeared into new identities, they left nothing behind that anyone has ever been able to find. That level of disappearance is unusual even for a mutiny. It suggests either extraordinary misfortune, in which everyone who left the ship died before reaching shore, or extraordinary effort to remain hidden, which would require a kind of coordinated concealment that is hard to imagine 11 men managing without any crack appearing in it over the decades that followed. Lula Wormel, her father's most persistent advocate, believed in the mutiny theory more firmly than in any other. She focused on Herbert Bates. She was convinced that the tension her father had described in that Barbados letter was real and significant, and that Bates was at the centre of what had happened. She may have been right. She may also have been a grieving daughter looking for a human face to attach to her father's disappearance, which is an entirely understandable thing to do and does not necessarily make her wrong. The evidence she pointed to was real evidence. The letter was real. The Cape Lookout encounter was real. The smashed steering gear was real. But evidence pointing toward a cause is not the same as evidence that resolves the full question, and the full question of what happened to those 11 men remained, for her as for everyone else, without a satisfying answer. What the mutiny theory ultimately offers is the most human explanation for an event that otherwise feels almost impossible. It says that the Carroll A, Deering was not taken by the sea or by some inexplicable force, but by the tensions that had been building among its own crew, tensions that Wormel himself had sensed and had tried to put into words in a letter to his daughter from a port in Barbados. It is a story about people, about conflict and fear and whatever happened in those days between the Caribbean and the Carolina coast. In some ways that makes it more comprehensible than the alternatives, and in other ways it makes the silence that followed even harder to understand. Because if it was people who did this, then people knew what had happened. Someone knew, and whatever they knew, they took it with them into a silence that has not broken in more than 100 years. The mutiny theory leaves the story open rather than closing it, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about it. It is a framework that fits some of the evidence well, and fails to account for other parts of it, and it sits alongside the other explanations that investigators proposed, each of which has its own strengths and its own failures. One of those other explanations also centres on the unlit ship seen near the Deering on January 29th, and it takes the story in a somewhat different direction toward the particular character of the Atlantic coast in 1921, and the illegal trade that was moving through those waters in the first year of Prohibition. Prohibition arrived in the United States in January 1920, just a few months before the Carroll A. Deering departed on what would be its final voyage. The 18th Amendment had been ratified the year before, and by the time the Deering was loaded with coal in Norfolk and pointed south toward Rio de Janeiro, the illegal alcohol trade along the eastern seaboard was already organising itself into something surprisingly well structured, and in many places surprisingly bold. Ships running rum from the Caribbean and Canada were not rare. They were a feature of the coastline, and the waters off Cape Hatteras, with their complicated currents and their history of obscure navigation, were not unfamiliar territory for vessels that prefer to operate without drawing attention. This is the backdrop against which the piracy theory takes shape, and it is worth spending some time with it because it is not simply a dramatic flourish. It is a theory that several investigators took seriously, including Lawrence Ritchie, the special agent who conducted the formal inquiry under Herbert Hoover's Department of Commerce. Ritchie was not a credulous man. He was a careful, experienced investigator, and the fact that he considered piracy a genuine possibility says something about how seriously the evidence supported it. The central piece of evidence, the one that keeps appearing in any serious discussion of this theory, is the unlit ship seen near the Deering on January 29, 1921. The Cape Lookout lightship keeper, Thomas Jacobson, had already noted the strange encounter on January 28th, when the Deering passed and a crew member with reddish hair and a foreign accent hailed the lightship to report the loss of both anchors. That detail alone was odd enough. But the following day, January 29th, another vessel was spotted in the same general area near the Deering, and this vessel was running without lights and ignoring signals. The lightship keeper tried to raise it. It did not respond. It continued on its course as if the signals were not happening, which in the maritime world of 1921 was not the behaviour of a vessel with nothing to hide. A ship running without lights in those waters, in that period, was almost certainly doing so deliberately. Navigational lights existed precisely because those waters were dangerous, because Diamond Shoals was a graveyard for ships that could not see what was around them. A vessel that chose darkness in that environment was either reckless beyond reason or had specific reasons to remain invisible. In 1921, along the Atlantic coast between the Caribbean and the Carolinas, those specific reasons most often had to do with what was in the hold. Rum-running operations during Prohibition varied enormously in their sophistication. Some were small, improvised affairs run by individual opportunists with a single boat and a contact on shore. Others were considerably more organised, with dedicated vessels, established routes, lookouts, and the kind of operational discipline that comes from treating illegal commerce as a business. The waters off the Carolinas were not a backwater for this trade. They were part of an active corridor, and the vessels involved in it were accustomed to moving quickly, avoiding contact, and leaving no record of where they had been. What the piracy theory suggests is that the unlit ship was one of these vessels, and that at some point between January 29th and January 31st, it came alongside the Carroll A Deering, and something happened. The nature of that something is where the theory branches. One version holds that the rum runners needed the Deering's crew for some purpose, perhaps as forced labour, perhaps because they wanted to use the schooner itself for their own operations, and that the crew was taken aboard the other vessel against their will. Another version is darker, suggesting that the crew was killed and disposed of at sea, which would explain the complete absence of survivors without requiring anyone to have successfully hidden 11 people for a century. The evidence that fits this theory is, in some ways, more coherent than the evidence for mutiny when it comes to explaining the physical state of the ship. The steering gear on the Carroll A Deering was not merely damaged, it was smashed. The binnacle, which houses the compass, was destroyed. These are not the actions of men trying to escape a ship. These are the actions of people who want to make sure the ship cannot be sailed away. If a group of men had boarded the Deering and taken the crew, disabling the steering gear would be a logical step. It would prevent anyone who remained from following them, and it would ensure that the Deering itself, now empty, would drift and eventually ground, becoming a problem for the authorities rather than a clue pointing back toward the people who had boarded her. The removal of the ship's papers and navigation logs fits this pattern as well. If pirates boarded the Deering, they would have reason to take anything that could identify the encounter, any record that might later be used to piece together where the ship had been and what had happened to it. The log, in particular, would have contained entries about the unlit ship, about any contact made, about the position and the time. Taking it removes a potential witness. It is a practical act, not a panicked one, which suggests people who had done something like this before and knew what to take. The galley fire is the detail that sits most uncomfortably with the piracy theory, just as it does with every other theory. The food was cooking, the stove was lit. Pork and beans, coffee, whatever else was on the burners that morning in late January. A meal was being prepared for 11 men. This suggests that the crew was going about their ordinary morning routine when whatever happened, happened. It was not a situation they had anticipated. They did not have time to put out the fire before they left, or they were not given time, or they simply did not think of it in the urgency of the moment. All of those possibilities are consistent with a sudden boarding by another vessel, with people appearing on deck without warning, and the crew having no opportunity to do anything except respond to what was in front of them. It is also worth noting that the lifeboats were missing from their davits. One damaged lifeboat was found trailing behind the Deering, which suggests it had been used or at least deployed. The sea conditions on January 31st, when the Deering was found grounded, were not calm, but the days immediately before had been manageable enough for small boats. If 11 men had been transferred from the Deering to another vessel, lifeboats would have been one way to accomplish that transfer, particularly if the other ship was unwilling or unable to come fully alongside. The missing boats, combined with the damaged one trailing behind, suggests movement between vessels, which is consistent with piracy, but also, it should be said, with other explanations. Then there is the note in the bottle, which arrived in April 1921, when a man named Christopher Columbus Gray found it on the North Carolina shore. The note claimed to be written by the Deering's engineer, identified as Henry Bates, though no crew member of that name was actually aboard the Deering. The note said the crew was being held prisoner by pirates, and asked whoever found it to report the situation to headquarters. It was, on its face, exactly the kind of evidence that would confirm the piracy theory. It was also, after investigation, determined to be a hoax. The State Department took the note seriously enough to conduct a handwriting analysis and a thorough examination of the paper and ink. None of it matched. The handwriting did not correspond to any crew member's known writing. The paper and ink were inconsistent with what would have been available aboard the Deering. Christopher Columbus Gray, the man who found the note, came under suspicion of having written it himself, though this was never conclusively proved. What the note reveals, more than anything about the Deering, is how desperately people wanted a concrete answer. Someone wanted the piracy theory to be confirmed badly enough to fabricate evidence for it, or at least that is one reading of what happened. The note is a kind of mirror of the investigation's frustration, a manufactured resolution for a situation that refused to resolve itself. The hoax does not disprove piracy, of course. It only removes one piece of evidence that turned out not to be evidence at all. The unlit ship remains, the disabled steering gear remains, the missing papers and log remain, the sudden, mid-meal departure remains. None of those things were fabricated, and none of them are satisfactorily explained by the note being a hoax. What the piracy theory struggles with is the same fundamental problem that troubles all the explanations for the Carroll A. Deering. 11 men. Not one of them ever surfaced. If they were taken by rum runners and pressed into service on another vessel, they would eventually have reached a port somewhere. They would have been seen. Someone would have recognised them, or they would have found a way to communicate, or one of them would have escaped and told the story. The world of 1921 was not so vast and so disconnected that 11 American sailors could simply disappear into it without leaving any trace across the years that followed. If they were killed at sea, the ocean sometimes returns what it takes, and it returned nothing from the Deering's crew. No bodies, no personal effects that could be identified, nothing that pointed back toward 11 specific men. Lawrence Ritchie's investigation, working with the resources of the federal government and the cooperation of foreign governments, contacted through the State Department, found no evidence of the Deering's crew anywhere. More than 2,000 ships were asked to watch for survivors or wreckage. Dozens of countries were contacted through diplomatic channels. The inquiry was, by the standards of the time, extraordinarily thorough, and it produced nothing. Not a name, not a sighting, not a rumour that could be followed to a real person. The piracy theory offers a mechanism for what happened on the Deering, but it cannot explain the completeness of what came after. There is something almost more unsettling about the piracy theory than about the mutiny theory, if you think about it from a certain angle. Mutiny, at least, is an internal story. It is about the people who were already on that ship, their conflicts and their desperation, the breakdown of order in a confined space over a long voyage. Piracy introduces an external force, strangers who came from somewhere and went back to somewhere, and the idea that 11 men could be taken by those strangers and simply erased from the record is a different kind of disturbing. It suggests a world in which people can disappear not because of anything they did or any conflict they were part of, but simply because they were in the wrong place when a ship without lights came alongside in the dark. The Prohibition-era Atlantic was, in certain respects, genuinely lawless in ways that are easy to underestimate from this distance. The rum-running trade involved real violence at times, real confrontations between vessels, real situations in which the people involved had strong incentives to leave no witnesses. It is not impossible that something like that happened to the Deering. It is also not proven. It is a theory that fits the outlines of the evidence without being confirmed by any of it in a way that closes the case. What the piracy theory does, perhaps more than anything else, is remind us that the Carroll A. Deering was not sailing through an empty ocean. It was sailing through a specific moment in American history, through waters that were being used for purposes that went unrecorded by design, past vessels that were deliberately invisible. The context of 1921 matters. The unlit ship that ignored signals on January 29th was not an anomaly in those waters. It was, in a grim way, almost ordinary. What happened after that encounter, if it was an encounter, is the part of the story that remains entirely in shadow. The investigation eventually had to set the piracy question aside, not because it was disproved, but because there was simply nothing more to find. The trail, such as it was, ended in the same place every other trail ended, with the grounded schooner on Diamond Shoals and the food cooling on the stove, and 11 men who were not there to explain themselves. Whether those men had been taken by strangers or had turned on each other or had met some other fate entirely, the result was the same. They were gone, and the theories that tried to account for their disappearance, each reasonable in its own way, each incomplete in its own way, pointed toward a geography and a history that added yet another layer to the mystery. Because Diamond Shoals, where the Deering finally came to rest, sits at the edge of a region that would later acquire its own mythology, a mythology that has shaped how many people first encountered the story of the Carroll A. Deering, even if that mythology explains far less than it claims to. That mythology, of course, is the Bermuda Triangle, and it is worth spending some time here, not because the triangle explains anything about the Carroll A. Deering, but precisely because it does not, and because understanding why it does not is part of understanding what the Deering case actually is. Diamond Shoals lies roughly at the northern edge of what would eventually be mapped, loosely and controversially, as the Bermuda Triangle. The triangle as a defined concept did not exist in 1921. It would not be named or formalised until decades later. The term itself was coined by writer Vincent Gaddis in a 1964 article in Argosy magazine, and then popularised far beyond anything Gaddis probably anticipated by Charles Berlitz's 1974 book, simply titled The Bermuda Triangle. That book became one of the best-selling non-fiction titles of the decade. It sold tens of millions of copies. And among the cases it included, presented as evidence of something genuinely inexplicable and possibly supernatural occurring in that stretch of ocean, was the Carroll A. Deering. For many people, that book was how they first heard of the Deering, which means that for many people, the ship arrived pre-packaged in a framework that was already asking them to consider explanations involving time warps, alien abduction, and vortices of unknown energy. Berlitz was not a subtle writer. He was not particularly interested in careful distinctions between what was documented and what was speculative. He was interested in accumulating cases that felt strange and presenting them in a way that suggested a pattern for which the triangle itself was the explanation. The Deering fit the accumulation nicely. An abandoned ship, 11 missing men, no explanation. The triangle framing offered a kind of answer by refusing to offer a specific one, suggesting instead that the region itself was the cause, that something about that particular geometry of ocean between Miami, Bermuda and Puerto Rico swallowed ships and people and left questions behind. It is worth being direct about this. The Bermuda Triangle as a paranormal or anomalous zone is not supported by the evidence. The United States Coast Guard has stated as much. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market that has been tracking maritime losses for centuries, does not charge higher premiums for ships passing through the triangle. The area does not have a statistically higher rate of disappearances than other heavily trafficked ocean regions. What it has is a large volume of traffic, a long history of maritime activity, and a cultural mythology that began accumulating in the mid-20th century and proved extremely durable. When researchers have gone back and examined the cases Berlitz and others cited, they have found that many of them were misrepresented, that some of the ships supposedly lost in the triangle disappeared outside it, that weather and human error account for most of the incidents, and that the pattern Berlitz identified was largely a pattern of selective presentation rather than a pattern in the ocean itself. None of this means the Carroll A Deering is an ordinary case. It is not. But the triangle framing actually obscures what makes the Deering genuinely puzzling, because it substitutes a vague supernatural geography for the specific human, documented strangeness of what was found on that ship. The food on the stove is strange because it suggests people who expected to eat a meal and then did not. The smashed steering gear is strange because it suggests a deliberate act by someone with a specific intention. The missing log and papers are strange because they represent information that someone chose to take or destroy. These are human details. They point toward human decisions, human conflicts, human events. The triangle framing dissolves all of that specificity into a general atmosphere of the inexplicable, which is, in a way, less honest about the mystery than simply saying we do not know what happened, and here is what the evidence actually shows. What the geography of the area does contribute legitimately is context for how the ship ended up where it did. Cape Hatteras and the waters around it are genuinely among the most dangerous along the entire eastern seaboard. The region has been called the graveyard of the Atlantic, and that name was earned over centuries, not invented for atmosphere. More than 1,000 documented shipwrecks lie on the seafloor in that area. The reason is not supernatural, it is physical. Two major ocean currents meet near Cape Hatteras, the cold Labrador current flowing south and the warm Gulf Stream flowing north. Where they meet, the water is turbulent, the weather is unpredictable, and the conditions can change with remarkable speed. Beneath the surface, the shoals extend far from shore, shallow and shifting, invisible from the deck of a ship until it is too late. Diamond Shoals itself, where the Deering grounded, extends roughly 14 miles out from Cape Hatteras Point. It has claimed ships for as long as ships have sailed those waters. The Deering's grounding there was, in that specific sense, not unusual. Ships ran aground on Diamond Shoals regularly. The graveyard of the Atlantic earned its name through accumulated ordinary catastrophe, through storms and navigational errors and the treachery of those shallow, current-churned waters. What was unusual, of course, was not that the Deering grounded. It was what the boarding party found when they finally got aboard. A ship can run aground for all kinds of reasons. A ship does not cook dinner for 11 people, and then leave without them for any reason that fits neatly into a category. The lightship stationed near Cape Hatteras existed precisely because the area was so dangerous. Lightships were floating lighthouses, anchored in positions where fixed structures could not be built, warning passing vessels of hazards. The Cape Lookout lightship, where a crew member of the Deering hailed the keeper on January 28th and reported the lost anchors, was part of a network of such vessels along that coast. The keeper, Thomas Jacobson, took note of the encounter specifically because something about it seemed off, because a lower-ranking crew member was doing the speaking instead of the captain, or first mate, because the man had a foreign accent and reddish hair and was not behaving the way a crew member typically behaved when hailing a lightship. Jacobson tried to radio his report to the authorities. His radio was broken. By the time the Deering was found grounded 3 days later, Jacobson's observation had not been passed on through any official channel. It became part of the record only after the investigation began, and investigators went back to interview the lightship crew. That detail matters, and it is the kind of detail that gets flattened when the Deering is filed under triangle mythology. The Cape Lookout encounter is a specific, documented human moment. It is a man on a ship speaking to a man on a lightship, and something about that conversation was strange enough that the lightship keeper remembered it and reported it when asked. That is not the Bermuda Triangle. That is a witness. That is evidence. It points towards something that was already wrong on the Deering before it reached Diamond Shoals, something that was wrong in a way that involved specific people making specific decisions. The actual geography of the Deering's final voyage is, in its own way, more interesting than the triangle mythology, because it is a geography of real hazards and real human decisions made in response to them. The ship was returning north from the Caribbean, hugging the coast as sailing vessels typically did, passing through waters that experienced mariners knew were dangerous and that required careful navigation. The loss of both anchors, which the red-haired crew member reported at Cape Lookout, was a serious problem. Anchors are not just for stopping, they are for holding position in difficult conditions, for managing a vessel in tight or dangerous waters. A ship without anchors in those waters, approaching those shoals, was already in a precarious situation. Whether the anchors were lost in a storm, or cut loose deliberately, or lost in some other way connected to whatever was happening aboard the ship, is one of the questions the investigation could not answer. But the geography makes the loss of the anchors significant in a way that a more open ocean setting would not. There is something else the geography contributes, which is a sense of how many eyes were and were not on those waters at that time. The eastern seaboard shipping lanes were busy. There were light ships and lighthouses and coastguard stations and ports. The Deering was not sailing through empty wilderness. It was sailing through a monitored traffic stretch of ocean. And yet the unlit ship seen near the Deering on January 29th was never identified. No one came forward to say they had been that ship. No investigation ever produced a name for it. In waters that busy, in a period when the investigation involved contacting thousands of vessels and dozens of governments, the mystery ship simply remained a mystery ship. That is its own kind of strange. The triangle mythology, when it absorbed the Deering, took all of this specific geography and specific human strangeness and replaced it with a single, vague explanation. The region is anomalous. Things disappear there. No further inquiry is necessary. That is, in a way, the least satisfying possible response to a case that is full of specific, answerable-seeming questions. Where was the captain when the crew member hailed a Cape Lookout lightship? What happened to the anchors? Who was on the unlit ship? Why was the steering gear deliberately smashed? These are not questions that require a supernatural answer. They are questions that require information we do not have. The triangle does not provide that information. It simply suggests that asking for it is futile, that the region itself is the explanation. The Carroll A Deering deserves better than that, and so do the 11 men who were on it. Because whatever happened to them happened in the physical world, on a real ship, in real water, under real circumstances that involved real decisions by real people. The triangle framing has kept the Deering in circulation as a cultural curiosity, which is perhaps the one service it has done the case. Berlitz's book introduced the story to readers who might never have encountered it otherwise, and some of those readers became curious enough to look past the triangle mythology and find the actual documented record, the State Department files, Lula Wormel's letters, Thomas Jacobson's account, Lawrence Ritchie's investigation. The mythology, in that sense, accidentally preserved interest in a case that might otherwise have faded entirely from public awareness. But the mythology also distorted the case in ways that matter. It placed the Deering in a category of the fundamentally unexplainable, which made it easier to stop asking specific questions. It associated the ship with stories that were far less documented and far more embellished, lumping it together with cases that had been misrepresented or fabricated entirely, which made it harder for people to take the Deering's genuine strangeness seriously. The ship became a piece of triangle folklore rather than a specific, documented, deeply puzzling historical event. And the specific, documented, deeply puzzling historical event is the more interesting thing. What the geography of Cape Hatteras and Diamond Shoals actually tells us about the Carroll A Deering is this. The ship ended up exactly where a ship without anchors and with disabled steering might end up in those waters. The graveyard of the Atlantic earned its name from physics, from currents and shoals and weather, and the Deering's grounding fits that physical reality. But the grounding is the least mysterious part of the story. The most mysterious part of the story was already in motion before the ship reached those shoals, in the conversation at Cape Lookout, in the strange behaviour of the crew, in the unlit ship that appeared and disappeared without explanation. The Triangle had nothing to do with any of that. Whatever happened on the Carroll A, Deering happened to people, not to a region. And while the Triangle mythology settled into the cultural background, drawing readers in television programs and documentary filmmakers toward the Deering as one entry in a long list of inexplicable disappearances, the actual investigators, the ones working in 1921 with the tools and resources available to them, were trying to answer a different set of questions. Questions about weather, about physical evidence, about what the sea itself might have done to a ship and its crew before anyone found it grounded on the shoals. Because not every explanation for the Deering requires human agency. Some of them require only the Atlantic in January, and what the Atlantic in January is capable of doing to a vessel and the people aboard it. And so the investigators did look at the weather. It would have been irresponsible not to. Cape Hatteras in January is not a gentle place. The Atlantic along that stretch of the Carolina coast is one of the more unpredictable bodies of water on the eastern seaboard, and the people conducting the investigation in 1921 knew that. They were not naive about what the sea could do. Before settling on any theory involving human decisions, it was reasonable to ask whether the ocean itself had simply taken the crew, swept the deck clean in some sudden and catastrophic way, and left the ship drifting and eventually grounded with no one left to steer it. The idea is not as far-fetched as it might initially sound. The waters around Cape Hatteras and Diamond Shoals are subject to weather changes that can arrive with very little warning. The area sits at the convergence of the cold Labrador Current moving south and the warm Gulf Stream moving north, and where those two bodies of water meet, conditions can become volatile in ways that don't always show up clearly in advance forecasts, especially in 1921 when weather prediction was considerably less sophisticated than it is today. Sudden squalls, rising swells, and dramatic shifts in wind direction were all documented hazards in that region. January specifically is one of the more turbulent months along that coast. Waterspouts are another phenomenon worth considering. They form over warm water, and while the Gulf Stream is warm even in winter, waterspouts in January are less common than in summer months but not impossible. A waterspout making contact with a vessel or passing close enough to generate violent turbulence could theoretically cause chaos on deck. People could be thrown overboard. Equipment could be damaged. A crew caught off guard by a sudden and violent weather event might not have had time to respond in any organised way. Rogue waves are the other natural possibility that investigators and researchers have raised over the years. These are single, unusually large waves that can form in open ocean under certain conditions, particularly in areas where currents converge and wind and swell move in conflicting directions. The waters around Cape Hatteras meet at least some of those conditions. A rogue wave striking a vessel broadside could sweep the deck entirely, take everyone on it, and leave the ship intact but empty. The ship itself would continue on its course, or drift, until it grounded. These are all real physical phenomena. They deserve to be taken seriously as possibilities, and the investigators in 1921 did take them seriously. But when you set these natural explanations against the specific evidence found aboard the Carroll A. Deering, something doesn't fit. Several things, actually. The food is the first problem. When the Coast Guard boarded the ship on February 4th, the galley stove was still warm, and there was food in the process of being prepared. Pork and beans in a pot, coffee ready, a meal being made for the whole crew. If a rogue wave had swept the deck and taken 11 men in a matter of seconds, the cook would have been taken too, and the stove would have been abandoned mid-task. That part actually fits. But the specific nature of the food preparation matters here. This was not a quick snack or a cup of coffee left behind. It was a full meal being prepared, which suggests the cook was working with some deliberateness, with some expectation that the crew would be sitting down to eat shortly. That is consistent with a sudden, unexpected event. but it is also consistent with a crew that was still functioning, still eating, still maintaining some kind of shipboard routine right up until whatever happened, happened. What the food on the stove cannot tell us is whether the crew was swept away by a wave, or whether they left the ship under their own power, or someone else's. The stove is ambiguous in that way. It tells us something was interrupted. It doesn't tell us what interrupted it. The steering gear is less ambiguous. The investigation found that the steering mechanism aboard the Carroll A Deering had been deliberately disabled. This was not the kind of damage you would expect from a storm or a wave. Storm damage to a ship's steering gear tends to look like impact damage, like something struck it or was thrown against it, or like mechanical failure under stress. What the investigators found on the Deering looked like intentional destruction. The binnacle, which houses the compass and is a critical navigation instrument, had also been damaged. These are not things that a rogue wave does. A wave does not selectively destroy navigation equipment while leaving the galley stove burning and the food warm. The anchors present a similar problem for the natural disaster theory. The ship had lost both of its anchors before it was found grounded on Diamond Shoals. The crew member who hailed the Cape Lookout lightship on January 28th reported this, and the boarding party confirmed it. Now anchors can be lost in storms. A vessel caught in violent weather might drop an anchor to try to hold position, and if the conditions are bad enough, the anchor chain can part under the strain, and the anchor is gone. That does happen. But losing both anchors in that sequence requires a particular set of circumstances, and more importantly, if the anchors were lost in a storm violent enough to sweep 11 men off the deck, you would expect to see other evidence of that storm's violence on the ship itself. The hull, when the Deering was eventually inspected more thoroughly in Wilmington, was found to be structurally sound. There was no evidence of catastrophic storm damage to the vessel. The ship was intact. It had run aground on the shoals, but that is what an unsteered ship in those waters might do regardless of the weather. The lifeboats are perhaps the most telling detail. When the boarding party arrived, the lifeboats were gone from their davits. Davits are the brackets and rigging that hold lifeboats in place on the side of a ship. One damaged lifeboat was found trailing behind the vessel on a line, but the others were simply absent. Now, if a rogue wave or a sudden storm had swept the deck, it might conceivably have taken crew members overboard. It might even have damaged or dislodged equipment. But lifeboats secured in their davits do not simply disappear in a storm without leaving significant evidence of the force required to remove them. The davits themselves were not reported as heavily damaged in the way you would expect if the boats had been torn away by wave action. The more natural reading of missing lifeboats is that they were launched, that someone or several someones deliberately put them in the water and left in them, and that is the point where the natural disaster theory runs into its fundamental limitation. It can explain some of the evidence, but it cannot explain the combination of evidence. It cannot explain why the steering gear was deliberately destroyed. It cannot explain why the ship's papers and the navigation log were missing. Documents do not wash overboard in a storm in any selective way. A storm that took the crew would have taken loose papers too, but it would not have specifically removed the official records while leaving personal belongings behind in the cabins. The investigators noted that the officers' quarters had been ransacked, which is another detail that does not fit a natural disaster. A wave does not ransack a cabin. It floods it, damages it, scatters things. Ransacking implies someone looking for something, or someone expressing anger, or someone covering a trail. The weather along Cape Hatteras in the days immediately before the Deering was found was also examined. January 1921, records for the area do not describe conditions so extreme that they would explain the simultaneous disappearance of 11 people without a trace. There had been weather. There was often weather in that region in January, but the conditions were not, as far as the historical record shows, so catastrophic that a sudden and total loss of crew from a structurally intact vessel becomes the obvious explanation. The ship grounded on Diamond Shoals, which was consistent with a vessel that had lost its steering and its anchors in conditions that were difficult, but not necessarily unprecedented. The grounding itself was the least mysterious thing about the discovery. There is one more detail worth sitting with here. the red distress lights. Before the Deering was boarded, before anyone knew what was inside, the crew of the Cape Hatteras lightship reported seeing red distress signals set aboard the grounded vessel. Red lights. Someone had set distress signals, or they had been set before whatever happened, and no one had removed them. Either way, distress signals are a human action. They require someone to make a decision, to locate the signals, to deploy them. A rogue wave does not set distress signals. A waterspout does not set distress signals. Whatever caused those red lights to be burning on the grounded hull of the Carroll A, Deering, it was a person or persons who put them there. So the natural disaster theory, taken seriously and examined carefully, does what all the other theories do. It explains part of the picture and leaves the rest unexplained. It can account for the grounding. It can account for rough conditions, for the loss of the anchors, possibly even for some of the chaos visible in the ship's condition. But it cannot account for the deliberate destruction of the steering gear. It cannot account for the missing papers and log. It cannot account for the ransacked cabins or the missing lifeboats deployed from their davits. And it cannot account for the fact that 11 men, in waters that were being monitored and travelled by other vessels, were never found. Not a single body. Not a single survivor. Not a piece of clothing or a personal item that could be definitively traced to any of them washing up on the shore. Nature is capable of extraordinary things. The Atlantic in January is not something to underestimate, and anyone who has spent time near Cape Hatteras in winter knows that the weather there can change in ways that feel almost personal, almost deliberate. The sea in that region has a long history of taking ships and people without explanation or apology. But the sea, even at its most violent, tends to leave evidence of its violence. Wreckage, damage, marks on the hull, broken equipment consistent with impact or stress. The Carroll A Deering showed some of those marks, but not enough of them, and mixed in with them were marks of a very different kind. Marks that suggested human decisions, human actions, human conflict. The natural disaster theory, in the end, is the most comfortable of all the explanations. It requires no villain, it requires no crime, no conspiracy, no betrayal. It places the loss of 11 men in the category of tragedy rather than mystery, and there is something in human nature that finds tragedy easier to accept than the open, unresolved question of what someone did to someone else in the middle of the ocean. But comfort is not the same as accuracy, and the evidence aboard the Carroll A Deering, taken as a whole, does not point toward comfort. It points toward people, toward decisions made under pressure, or anger, or fear. Toward someone who smashed the steering gear and removed the papers and left the food cooking on the stove. Toward 11 men who went somewhere, or were taken somewhere, and never came back. The sea may have played a role. The weather may have made things worse. But the human element in this story is too visible, too specific, too deliberately present in the evidence to be washed away by any wave, however large, which brings the investigation, inevitably, back to the people who were on that ship, back to what was known about them, and what was suspected, and what the one person with the most personal stake in the answer spent years of her life trying to find out. Because Lula Wormel was not willing to let the sea take the explanation along with her father. She wanted to know what had happened to Willis Wormel, and she was prepared to ask that question to anyone who would listen. Lula Wormel was not a sailor. She had not been aboard the Carroll A Deering, had not seen the ports it stopped in, had not met the crew her father was working with on that final voyage south and back. What she had was something more durable than first-hand experience. She had letters. She had her father's own words, written from Barbados, telling her things he apparently felt he could not say to anyone else. And she had the particular, quiet ferocity of a person who has lost someone and refuses to accept that the loss simply has no explanation. Willis Wormel had written to his daughter during the voyage. That was not unusual. He was a man of his generation, a mariner who understood that letters were how you stayed connected to the people you loved when the sea put distance between you. What was unusual was the content of those letters, or at least of the ones that came from Barbados during the return leg of the journey. He wrote to Lula about the crew. He wrote about Herbert Bates, the first mate, in terms that were careful but worried. He described Bates as difficult, as someone who was creating problems aboard the ship, as someone he was not sure he could fully manage. The exact phrasing varied depending on which account you read, and the letters themselves became part of the historical record that Lula would later share with investigators. But the tone was consistent. Wormel was an experienced captain who had spent decades at sea, and he was, by his own admission, troubled by the man he was sailing with. This is worth sitting with for a moment. A 66-year-old captain, experienced enough to have been trusted with a large commercial vessel, writing to his daughter from a port stop to express concern about his first mate. Not a passing complaint about professional disagreements, the kind of friction that happens on any long voyage between people who are living and working in close quarters. Something more specific than that. Something that made him feel, apparently, that it was worth putting into writing and sending home. Lula kept those letters, and when the Carroll A Deering was found empty on Diamond Shoals, and her father did not come home, those letters became the starting point of her own investigation. She was not a government official. She had no authority to compel testimony or demand documents. What she had was persistence, and a willingness to write letters of her own, and a clear sense that the official investigations being conducted by the State Department and the Bureau of Navigation were not moving fast enough, or asking the right questions, or paying enough attention to the specific human details that she believed were central to understanding what had happened. She wrote to the State Department. She wrote to members of Congress. She wrote to the Bureau of Navigation. She wrote to anyone in an official position who might have information, or who might be able to apply pressure to get information. Her letters were polite, but they were not passive. She asked specific questions. She followed up when she did not receive answers. She pushed back when she received responses that she found evasive or incomplete. For a private citizen in the early 1920s, navigating the bureaucratic structures of multiple federal agencies while simultaneously grieving the disappearance of her father, this was a remarkable thing to do. And it was not a brief effort. Lula Wormel's investigation continued for years. She also did something that the federal investigators, with all their resources, had not done as thoroughly. She talked to people. Dock workers who had seen the Deering in port. Sailors who had been in Barbados at the same time. Anyone who might have had contact with the ship or its crew during the final weeks of the voyage. She was trying to build a picture from the ground up, from the human level, from the conversations and observations that official reports tended to flatten into summary and bureaucratic language. What she found through these conversations and through her own careful reading of the available evidence led her firmly toward the mutiny theory. She believed that Herbert Bates had been the central figure in whatever had happened aboard the Carroll A Deering. The letters from her father pointed in that direction. The account from the Cape Lookout lightship, where a crew member who was not the captain and not the first mate had hailed the lightship and reported the lost anchors, speaking in a way that was described as unusual and with a foreign accent, suggested to Lula that the normal chain of command aboard the ship had already broken down before the Deering reached Diamond Shoals. A captain does not send a lower crew member to speak for him to a lightship. If Wormel was alive and in command, he would have handled that communication himself, or sent Bates. The fact that neither the captain nor the first mate appeared at the rail was, in Lula's reading of the situation, significant. She focused on Bates with a particular intensity, not because she had proof, but because the evidence she had access to, her father's letters, the accounts of people who had been in Barbados, the circumstances of the discovery, all pointed towards someone aboard the ship who had been in conflict with the captain and who had the motivation and possibly the means to do something about it. Whether that meant Bates had led a mutiny, or had organised the crew against Wormel, or had done something more violent and specific, she could not say with certainty. But she was convinced that Bates was not an innocent figure, and she said so in writing to the people she was corresponding with. The federal investigators were not unaware of this theory. Lawrence Ritchie, the special agent conducting the investigation under Herbert Hoover at the Department of Commerce, had also looked at the mutiny angle and had taken Wormel's letters seriously as evidence. But the problem that confronted every investigator, including Lula, was the same problem that confronted every theory about the Carroll A. Deering. The absence of the crew made it impossible to confirm anything. You could build a case for mutiny that fit the known facts. You could point to Wormel's letters, to the broken steering gear, to the missing log, to the unusual behaviour at Cape Lookout. But without a single crew member to question, without a body, without a confession, without any physical evidence that directly connected a named individual to a specific act, the case remained circumstantial. This is one of the things that makes Lula Wormel's investigation so humanly affecting, and also so painful to read about. She was right in the sense that she was asking the right questions and focusing on the right people. She had access to information, her father's own words, that no one else had in quite the same way. She understood the human dimension of the story better than any government agency could, because it was her father, and she had known him, and she had read his letters, and she could hear in those letters something that an official report cannot easily capture, the voice of a man who was worried, who was out of his element in some way, who was managing a situation that he found genuinely difficult. But being right about the questions is not the same as finding the answers. And the answers in the case of the Carroll A. Deering simply were not there to be found. Not in the documents, not in the testimony of witnesses, not in the physical evidence from the ship. Lula wrote her letters and conducted her interviews and pushed the federal agencies for years, and what she received in return was ultimately the same thing everyone else received: a large collection of carefully documented uncertainty. There is something in that which feels important to acknowledge, not as a dramatic irony, but as a plain human fact. The person with the most reason to find the truth, a daughter looking for her father, and the most personal knowledge of the circumstances, spent years of her life on this question and never got a satisfying answer. That is not a failure of intelligence or persistence. It is a reflection of how thoroughly this particular event had erased its own evidence. 11 men, a ship, a voyage, and whatever happened in the waters off Cape Hatteras in late January 1921, and almost nothing left behind that could be assembled into a clear account of events. Lula's correspondence with the State Department became part of the official file on the case. Hundreds of pages of documents, letters, reports and communications that the State Department accumulated in its investigation, and within those pages, her voice is one of the most specific and human. She's not writing in bureaucratic language. She is writing as someone who wants to know what happened to her father, and who is frustrated that the machinery of government, for all its resources and reach, cannot tell her. She never received a conclusion. The investigation, as we'll come to, did not end with a finding. It simply stopped producing new information and was eventually set aside. For Lula, that meant living the rest of her life without knowing. Without knowing whether her father had been killed by his own crew, or taken by pirates, or lost in some other way that the evidence had failed to capture. Without knowing what the last hours aboard the Carroll A. Deering had looked like, or what Willis Wormel had experienced in those hours, or whether the worry he had expressed in his letters from Barbados had been justified in the worst possible way. What she did leave behind, through her persistence and her willingness to keep asking, was a record. The letters she wrote, the questions she raised, the specific focus on Herbert Bates as a figure of interest, all of that became part of the documented history of the case in a way that might not have happened without her. The federal investigators had their own priorities and their own methods, and they were working across a large number of agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and competing theories. Lula was working on one question: what happened to her father? That focus gave her investigation a clarity that the official process sometimes lacked. It also gave the story something that pure mystery tends to strip away: a human centre. The Carroll A. Deering is often discussed as a puzzle, as a set of unexplained facts, as a case study in maritime disappearance, and it is all of those things. But at the centre of it is a 66-year-old captain who wrote worried letters to his daughter from a Caribbean port stop, and a daughter who spent years trying to find out why he never came home. That is the human story inside the ghost ship story, and it does not resolve. It just sits there, specific and quiet, inside all the larger uncertainty. The investigation that Lula pushed so hard to keep moving would eventually produce one more strange piece of evidence, not from the ship itself, and not from any witness or official source, but from a bottle found on a North Carolina beach several months after the Deering was discovered. A handwritten note, a claim of piracy, and a discovery that would turn out to say more about the desperation for answers than about the truth of what had happened aboard the Carroll A. Deering. The bottle was found in April 1921, roughly 3 months after the Carroll A. Deering had been discovered grounded on Diamond Shoals. A man named Christopher Columbus Gray, and that name is real, not invented for effect, was walking along the North Carolina shoreline near Buxton when he came across it. A glass bottle, sealed, with a piece of paper folded inside. He opened it and read what was written there, and then he did what anyone in that situation would do. He contacted the authorities and reported what he had found. The note claimed to be from Henry Bates, the engineer aboard the Carroll A. Deering, not Herbert Bates, the first mate who had been the focus of so much suspicion. Henry Bates, a different man entirely, one of the 11 crew members whose name had been on the ship's roster and who had vanished along with everyone else. The note said in rough terms that the crew had been taken prisoner by pirates, that the ship had been boarded, that the men were being held, and that whoever found the message should report it to the relevant authorities. It was, on its surface, exactly the kind of dramatic confirmation that investigators had been hoping for. Here, finally, was a direct communication from someone aboard the ship, explaining what had happened. Pirates, capture, a plea for help sent out in a bottle across the Atlantic. The State Department took it seriously, at least initially. They had to. Given the scale of the investigation already underway, given the involvement of multiple federal agencies, given the hundreds of pages of documentation that had already accumulated, a physical note from a crew member, if genuine, would have been the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. It would have confirmed the piracy theory, identified the nature of the threat, and potentially given investigators direction to pursue. So they examined it carefully. They brought in handwriting analysts. They compared the paper and the ink against known samples. They looked at the language used, the phrasing, the specific details in the note. And what they found was that none of it held up. The handwriting did not match any sample from Henry Bates or anyone else connected to the ship. The paper and ink were inconsistent with what would have been available aboard the Deering. The specific details in the note had a quality that investigators found suspicious. They were vague in some places and oddly specific in others, in a way that suggested someone constructing a story, rather than someone actually describing their situation. The note was, the investigators concluded, a hoax. Someone had written it, sealed it in a bottle, and either placed it on the beach or thrown it into the water near enough to shore that it would wash up. It had not come from the Carroll A. Deering. It had not come from Henry Bates. It was fabricated. Christopher Columbus Gray himself came under suspicion. He was the one who had found it, after all, and he was the one who had brought it forward. Investigators looked at him closely. There were questions about whether he had written the note himself, perhaps hoping for some kind of reward or recognition, or perhaps simply caught up in the public interest surrounding the case and wanting to be part of the story. No charges were ever filed against Gray. The investigation into the note's origins, like so much else in the Carroll A. Deering case, did not produce a definitive conclusion. It simply established that the note was not genuine, and then moved on. What is worth sitting with for a moment is what the hoax note actually represents, not as evidence of anything that happened aboard the ship, but as a kind of cultural artifact of the investigation itself. By April 1921, the Carroll A. Deering had been front-page news. The story had been covered in newspapers across the country. The image of the abandoned ship, the food on the stove, the missing crew, all of it had captured the public imagination in a way that was difficult to ignore. People were fascinated, and they were also, in some cases, motivated by that fascination in ways that were not entirely honest. The hoax note is a product of that environment. Someone, for reasons that were never fully established, decided to insert themselves into the story, to manufacture the one thing the investigation lacked, a direct account from someone who had been there. That impulse is understandable in a strange way, not excusable, but understandable. When a mystery reaches a certain level of public attention, it creates a kind of vacuum. The absence of answers becomes almost unbearable, and people fill vacuums in all kinds of ways. Some write letters to newspapers with their theories. Some contact investigators directly with second-hand information or half-remembered conversations. And some apparently write notes, seal them in bottles and leave them on beaches. The hoax note did not advance the investigation in any useful direction. What it did do was consume time and resources that were already stretched thin, and add another layer of noise to a case that was already drowning in contradictory information and dead ends. It also, in a quieter way, illustrated something about the piracy theory itself. The note's author had chosen piracy as the explanation, had chosen it specifically, had written a crew member pleading for rescue from pirates. That choice was not random. By April 1921, the piracy theory was already circulating in newspapers and in investigative discussions. The unlit ship seen near the Deering on January 29th, the evidence of a forced departure, the Prohibition-era rum-running context. All of that had made piracy one of the leading explanations in the public conversation. The note's author had absorbed that narrative and reproduced it, which means the note tells us something true, even though the note itself was false. It tells us that piracy was, at that moment, the story that felt most plausible to people following the case, the explanation that made the most intuitive sense, given everything that was known. That does not make it correct, but it does say something about where the investigation's centre of gravity was in the spring of 1921. Other debris from the Deering did wash ashore in the weeks and months after the ship was discovered. Pieces of wood, rope, fragments of equipment. None of it provided useful information. The sea has a way of stripping context from objects. A piece of timber washed up on a beach tells you very little about what happened to the ship it came from. Investigators documented what they could, but there was nothing in the physical debris that pointed toward a specific explanation. Nothing that contradicted the evidence already gathered from the ship itself. Nothing that added to it in any meaningful way. The ocean had taken the crew and left behind only the most general kind of evidence, that the ship had broken up in places, that things had fallen into the water, that the Atlantic had done what it always does with the objects human beings send into it. There is a particular frustration in this kind of investigation, and it is worth naming plainly. In a criminal case on land, evidence accumulates. Witnesses are interviewed. Physical evidence is collected and preserved. The scene of the event can be returned to, examined again, looked at from new angles. Time is on the investigator's side, at least to a degree, but a maritime disappearance in 1921 works almost entirely in reverse. The scene, the open ocean, the specific stretch of water between Barbados and Cape Hatteras, cannot be examined. The ship itself was damaged and then deliberately destroyed. The crew was gone. The witnesses who had seen the Deering at Cape Lookout could describe what they had observed, but they could not explain it. The unlit ship that had been seen nearby was never identified. The physical evidence from the Deering's interior told investigators what state the ship was in when it was found, but not how it had gotten into that state, or who was responsible. Every line of inquiry in this case eventually reached the same kind of wall. You could follow the evidence as far as it went, and it always went somewhere interesting, somewhere that pointed toward a theory, somewhere that made a particular explanation feel plausible, and then it stopped. The evidence ran out before the explanation could be completed. The hoax note is almost a perfect emblem of this pattern. Here is something that looks like evidence. Here is something that points toward an answer. And then, on closer examination, it dissolves. It was not real. It was someone's invention. The answer it seemed to offer was not actually there. What Gray thought he would gain from the note if he did write it is not entirely clear. The investigators who looked at him could not establish motive with any certainty. Some accounts suggest he may have hoped for a financial reward, given the level of federal attention the case was receiving. Others suggest he may have simply been caught up in the excitement of the story and wanted to contribute something, even if that something was fabricated. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. Another dead end, another piece of the case that had to be set aside, another thing that had seemed for a moment like it might matter and turned out not to. The State Department's file on the Carroll A Deering continued to grow through 1921 and into 1922. Correspondence with foreign governments, reports from special agents, letters from the public offering theories or claiming to have information, documents from the Bureau of Navigation and the Department of Commerce. Hundreds of pages, carefully organised, thoroughly documented, and reaching at their end no conclusion. The investigation did not close with a finding. It did not produce a report that said, "This is what happened, this is who was responsible, this is the explanation for the empty ship and the missing crew." It produced instead a very thorough record of everything that had been tried and everything that had failed to yield a definitive answer. Lawrence Ritchie, the special agent who had conducted much of the formal investigation under Herbert Hoover's oversight, had leaned at various points toward the piracy explanation. The rum-running context, the unlit ship, the evidence of forced departure, all of it fit a narrative in which the Deering had been boarded by people operating outside the law, people who had reasons to take the crew and leave no trace. But even Ritchie could not establish this with the kind of certainty that would have allowed the investigation to move from theory to conclusion. The unlit ship was never identified. No rum-running operation was ever connected to the Deering. No crew member ever surfaced in any context that might have explained what had happened to them. The piracy theory remained a theory, well supported in some respects, completely unverifiable in others. The hoax note had been one of the last significant developments in the active phase of the investigation. After it was determined to be fabricated, there were no more dramatic new pieces of evidence, no more witnesses coming forward with crucial information, no more physical discoveries on the shore that seemed to point somewhere meaningful. The case settled into a kind of quiet. The federal agencies that had been involved gradually turned their attention to other matters. The newspapers that had covered the story moved on to other stories. The Carroll A Deering remained in the files, in the State Department's files, in the records of the Bureau of Navigation, in the correspondence that Lula Warmel had generated through her years of persistent inquiry. But it was no longer producing new information. The ship itself was still a physical reality at this point, still floating, still structurally intact in its hull, even if its interior had been damaged and its crew was gone and its fate as a working vessel was clearly finished. What happened to the Carroll A? Deering as a physical object, its final days as something that existed in the world, before it was reduced to debris and memory, is a story that runs alongside the investigation's quiet conclusion, and it is worth following that thread to its end. The Carroll A Deering was towed off Diamond Shoals sometime in March of 1921, roughly 6 weeks after it had been spotted, grounded and empty by the Cape Hatteras lightship crew. The weather that had made boarding so difficult in the early days of February had eventually settled enough to allow salvage crews to work, and the ship, despite everything it had been through, despite the smashed steering gear and the missing anchors and the weeks of sitting on the shoals with the Atlantic working at its hull, was still largely intact as a vessel. That was one of the things that continued to puzzle people who examined it. A ship that had been through a catastrophic storm, or a violent boarding, or some kind of extreme event, might have shown more structural damage. The hull, when inspectors looked at it carefully in the weeks after the grounding, was found to be fundamentally sound. There were no holes. There was no evidence of the kind of damage that a severe storm or a collision would typically leave behind. The ship had grounded on the shoals, yes, and the shoals had done some damage to the exterior, but the Deering itself, the actual structure of the vessel, the 5 masts, the 255 feet of wooden hull, had survived its final voyage in better physical shape than you might expect given the circumstances. It was towed to Wilmington, North Carolina, where a more thorough inspection could be conducted on calmer water. Wilmington was a working port, and the Deering was brought in and tied up and looked over by people who knew ships and knew what damage looked like when it was caused by different things. The inspection confirmed what the initial boarding had suggested. The steering gear had not been damaged by weather or by the grounding. It had been deliberately disabled. The binnacle, which houses the compass, and is a fairly essential piece of navigation equipment, had been destroyed in a way that was not consistent with storm damage. These were not things that happened to a ship because the sea had been rough. These were things that someone had done on purpose. The inspection at Wilmington added weight to the theories that involved human action, mutiny, piracy, some kind of deliberate intervention, and took weight away from the natural disaster explanations. But it did not, of course, tell anyone who had done these things, or why, or what had happened afterward. The question of what to do with the Deering itself was a practical one, and it was answered in a fairly straightforward way. The ship was no longer seaworthy as a commercial vessel. Its captain and crew were gone. Its owner, the Deering Company, had no use for a ship in this condition. The vessel had already been declared a hazard to navigation while it sat on Diamond Shoals, and bringing it back into service would have required repairs and a crew, and a purpose that no one was in a position to provide. The decision was made to dispose of it. The Carroll A Deering, which had been built in Bath, Maine, in 1919, which had sailed to Rio de Janeiro and back, which had passed the Cape Lookout lightship with a red-haired man speaking in a foreign accent, which had been found with pork and beans warming on the stove and its crew nowhere to be found, was towed out to sea and sunk. Dynamite was used. The wreck was broken up deliberately so that it would not pose a danger to other ships. This happened in 1921, the same year the ship had been found. There is something quietly significant about that. The ship was destroyed in the same year it became a mystery. The physical object that contained whatever evidence remained, the galley where the food had been cooking, the officers' quarters that had been ransacked, the steering gear that had been smashed, the deck where 11 men had stood at some point on or before January 31st, was gone before the investigation had run its course, before Lula Wormel had finished writing her letters, before the State Department had closed its file, before anyone had come anywhere near a satisfying explanation. The Deering was sunk because it was a hazard, and because there was nothing else to do with it, and those are entirely reasonable justifications, but the effect was that the last physical piece of the puzzle was removed from the board while the puzzle was still very much unsolved. This is not unusual in maritime cases from this era. Ships that could not be salvaged were often destroyed, and the priority was navigation safety, not historical preservation. No one in 1921 was thinking about the Carroll A. Deering as a case that would still be discussed 100 years later. They were thinking about a damaged, crewless vessel sitting in a harbour, and about what to do with it practically. The decision makes complete sense in context, but looking back at it now, knowing that the case was never resolved, there is a particular kind of loss in the fact that the ship itself is gone. If the Deering were sitting somewhere today, accessible to modern forensic analysis, to the kinds of techniques that simply did not exist in 1921, it is possible, not certain, but possible, that something more might have been learned from it. The smashed steering gear, the galley, the spaces where the crew had lived and worked for months. Modern analysis might have found things that investigators in 1921 could not have found. But the ship is not sitting somewhere. It is on the bottom of the Atlantic, broken up by dynamite, and whatever it might have told us went down with it. The official investigation, such as it was by the time the ship was destroyed, did not end with a formal conclusion. This is worth being clear about, because it is one of the genuinely unusual things about the Carroll A. Deering case. Most investigations, even investigations that fail to produce a prosecution or a conviction, eventually produce some kind of official finding, some kind of statement that says, based on the evidence available, the most likely explanation is this. The Deering investigation did not produce that. The State Department's file, which ran to hundreds of pages of correspondence and reports and interagency communications, did not conclude with a summary finding. It concluded with the accumulation of everything that had been tried and everything that had been found insufficient. The investigation was not formally closed with a verdict. It was simply gradually set aside. The agencies involved turned their attention elsewhere. The correspondence slowed and then stopped. The file remained, carefully organised and thoroughly documented, but it was no longer being actively added to. Lawrence Ritchie, who had done much of the formal investigative work under Herbert Hoover's direction at the Department of Commerce, had leaned toward the piracy explanation in some of his reports. The rum-running context, the unlit ship seen near the Deering on January 29th, the evidence that the crew had left suddenly and under some kind of duress, these things fit together in a way that pointed toward an external actor, someone who had come aboard the Deering and taken or killed the crew. But Ritchie could not establish this. The unlit ship was never identified. No rum-running operation was ever connected to the Deering in any documented way. No crew member ever appeared in any context that might have shed light on what had happened. The piracy theory was, and remains, a reasonable hypothesis. It is not a conclusion. No charges were ever filed in connection with the Carroll A. Deering. This is worth saying plainly, because it is one of the things that distinguishes this case from a mystery with a hidden answer that investigators simply failed to find. It is possible that the answer was there and the investigators missed it, but it is also possible that the evidence genuinely did not point clearly enough toward any single explanation to support a legal conclusion. The threshold for filing charges is higher than the threshold for forming a theory, and the Deering investigation never crossed it. No one was ever accused formally of anything. No crew member was ever confirmed dead, which meant no murder investigation could be formally opened in any jurisdiction. No survivor was ever found, which meant no testimony was ever given. The case existed in a strange legal limbo where something had clearly happened. 11 people had disappeared from a ship in a way that showed signs of human intervention, but the legal machinery that might have produced accountability had nothing to grip. Lula Wormel was still writing letters at this point. Her correspondence with the State Department and the Bureau of Navigation continued even as the agencies themselves were moving on. She had more reason than anyone to keep pushing, and she did. Her father had sailed out of Barbados in January 1921 and had not come home, and she wanted to know why. She had focused on Herbert Bates, the first mate her father had described in his letter from Barbados as troublesome and possibly dangerous. She believed mutiny was the most likely explanation. She believed that something had happened aboard the Deering between Barbados and Cape Hatteras that involved the crew turning against the officers, but she could not prove it, and the agencies she was writing to could not prove it either, and eventually the correspondence slowed for her too. Not because she stopped caring, there is no evidence she ever stopped caring, but because there was nowhere left to write that had not already been written to, and no question left to ask that had not already been asked without a useful answer. The State Department's file on the Carroll A. Deering is a real thing. It exists. It has been examined by researchers and historians over the decades since 1921. It is one of the primary sources for what we know about the case, because it contains the correspondence, the reports, the witness accounts, the results of the handwriting analysis on the hoax note, the communications with foreign governments, the responses from the more than 2,000 ships that had been asked to watch for survivors or wreckage. Reading through it, you get a clear picture of how seriously the case was taken and of how thoroughly it was investigated by the standards of the time. You also get a clear picture of how little that thoroughness produced. The file is large, the conclusions are absent. The gap between those two things is the Carroll A. Deering case in miniature. There is a particular quality to an investigation that ends this way, not with a wrong answer, not with a covered-up answer, but with no answer at all. It is different from a cold case where the evidence points somewhere, but the resources to follow it ran out. It is different from a case where a conclusion was reached and later challenged. The Deering investigation reached a kind of honest exhaustion. The people conducting it were not incompetent. They were working with the tools available to them in 1921, in a world where the open ocean could not be searched, where a ship that had been destroyed could not be re-examined, where 11 missing people had left no trail that led anywhere that could be followed. They tried what they could try, they asked what they could ask, and then they stopped, because there was nothing left to do. The wreck of the Carroll A. Deering is somewhere in the Atlantic. The exact location of where it was sunk is not precisely documented in the records that have been made publicly available. It is out there, broken up by dynamite, the wooden hull long since deteriorated, the five-mast gone, the galley stove that had been keeping pork and beans warm on the morning of January 31st, reduced to whatever metal components might survive on the ocean floor after 100 years. The ship that had been built in Bath, Maine in 1919, that had been named after the owner's son, that had made its last voyage carrying coal to Rio de Janeiro and returning empty, is not a thing that exists in the world anymore, except as a record, as a file, as a story that people have been telling and retelling because it refuses to resolve itself into something comfortable and finished. What the investigation's quiet end tells us, really, is that some events leave enough evidence to know that something happened, but not enough to know exactly what. The Carroll A. Deering is one of those events. The smashed steering gear tells us something was done deliberately. The food on the stove tells us the crew left suddenly. The missing lifeboats tell us they left by choice or by force, not by being swept overboard. The missing log and ship's papers tell us someone wanted to remove information. The red-haired man speaking at Cape Lookout tells us the normal chain of command was already disrupted. All of these things are real. All of them point towards something. None of them, together or separately, point clearly enough toward a single explanation that can be stated as fact. The physical ship is gone. The official investigation produced no conclusion. The crew was never found. The file is closed not because the answer was found, but because the questions could no longer be actively pursued. What remains is the case itself, the details, the timeline, the evidence, the theories, and the quiet fact that 11 people sailed into the waters off Cape Hatteras in January 1921, and did not come out the other side in any way that the rest of the world was ever able to account for. And the Carroll A. Deering does not stand alone in this. It is not the only ship that has left a scene like this behind. A vessel found intact, a crew missing, a meal half prepared, a set of questions with no answers. The sea has produced these cases before and after 1921, and looking at the Deering alongside those other ships tells us something interesting about the pattern itself, about what ghost ships share, and about what makes the Deering, even in that company, a case that stands somewhat apart. The Mary Celeste is probably the most famous ghost ship in history, and it is the one the Carroll A. Deering is most often compared to. That comparison is worth spending some time with, because the two cases share enough that the similarities feel meaningful, and differ enough that the differences feel meaningful too. The Mary Celeste was a brigantine, much smaller than the Deering, about 103 feet long compared to the Deering's 255. She was found in the Atlantic in December 1872, sailing erratically between the Azores and the Portuguese coast. The crew of the Dei Gratia spotted her and sent men over to investigate. What they found has been described in maritime records ever since. The ship was seaworthy. The cargo of industrial alcohol was mostly intact. The personal belongings of the crew and the captain's family were all still aboard. The last entry in the ship's log was dated November 25th, 1872. The lifeboat was gone. The captain, Benjamin Briggs, his wife, his 2-year-old daughter, and 7 crew members and 10 people in total, were never found. No definitive explanation has ever been established, though theories have ranged from alcohol fumes causing a panic, to waterspout damage, to piracy, to insurance fraud gone wrong. The case has been examined and re-examined for over 150 years, and it remains genuinely open. The food detail in the Mary Celeste case is slightly different from the Deering. The accounts of a meal left half-eaten have been questioned by historians, and some of the more dramatic descriptions of the scene appear to have been embellished over time. But the core image is similar: a ship abandoned mid-voyage, a crew gone without a clear trace, a scene that suggested sudden departure rather than gradual decline. What the Deering shares with the Mary Celeste is the structural shape of the mystery. Both ships were found intact. Both had crews that vanished without bodies, without survivors, without a confession or a witness who could say what had happened. Both generated enormous public and official interest. Both have never been conclusively solved, and both have become the kind of stories that people return to because the absence of an answer creates a kind of gravity that pulls attention back again and again. But the differences between the two cases are also real, and they matter. The Mary Celeste disappeared in 1872, in an era when maritime communication was essentially non-existent, when the ability to investigate a disappearance at sea was extremely limited, and when the records available to later researchers are fragmentary. The Carroll A Deering disappeared in 1921, nearly 50 years later, in a world with radio communication, a functioning Coast Guard, a federal bureaucracy capable of mobilizing a large-scale investigation, and a much more complete system of documentation. The Deering case produced hundreds of pages of official records. It involved correspondence with foreign governments. It had multiple witness accounts from the Cape Lookout lightship encounter. It had the handwriting analysis of the hoax note, the physical inspection of the ship's hull, the testimony of people who had spoken with Captain Warmel in Barbados just days before the ship was found empty. The Deering case, in other words, had far more raw material for investigators to work with than the Mary Celeste ever did. And it still produced no answer. That is actually the more unsettling fact when you think about it. Not that the mystery exists, but that it persisted through a serious, well-resourced modern investigation and came out the other side unchanged. There are other ghost ship cases worth mentioning briefly, though they are less well documented and in some instances more disputed. The Orang Medan is one, a ship reportedly found in the Strait of Malacca sometime in the late 1940s, with all crew dead under strange circumstances, the ship subsequently catching fire and sinking before a full investigation could be conducted. The story has been repeated widely, but its historical documentation is thin enough that some researchers question whether the incident occurred at all in the form it has been described. It is a ghost ship story that may itself be partly a ghost, a tale that drifted into the record without a fully verifiable origin. The Joyita is more solidly documented. She was a 69-foot wooden vessel found adrift in the Pacific in November 1955, about 600 miles off course from her intended route between Samoa and Tokelau. Like the Deering, she was found with no one aboard. Like the Deering, her crew, 25 people in total, including passengers, were never found. The Joyita had a functioning radio, though it was tuned to a distress frequency that had limited range. Her refrigeration system was running. There was medical equipment aboard suggesting someone had been injured before the abandonment. The ship was listing badly due to a flooded engine room, but she was still afloat. Investigators concluded the crew likely abandoned ship in panic, possibly after the flooding began, and that the lifeboats they departed in were not adequate for the open Pacific. But no one was ever found, and the full sequence of events was never established. What the Joyita shares with the Deering is the specific quality of the scene left behind. A ship that looks like it was recently occupied, a crew that seems to have left in a hurry, evidence that points toward a sequence of events without completing that sequence. What makes the Deering different from the Joyita is the evidence of deliberate human action. The Joyita's situation can be explained at least partially, by mechanical failure and panic. The Deerings cannot. The smashed steering gear is the detail that keeps the Deering from fitting neatly into the category of maritime accident. Steering gear does not smash itself. The binnacle does not destroy itself. Someone did those things, and they did them deliberately, and that deliberate human action is what makes the Deering case more complicated than a ship that flooded and was abandoned in fear. The removal of the ship's papers and navigation log is another detail that separates the Deering from a simple accident. When a ship is abandoned in an emergency, the crew does not typically take the time to remove official documents. They grab survival gear, they lower lifeboats, they try to stay alive. The removal of the log and papers suggests either that someone wanted to prevent those documents from being read by investigators, or that whoever was in charge of the departure wanted to maintain some kind of record for themselves. Neither of those explanations fits neatly with a panicked emergency abandonment. They fit better with a planned departure, or a forced one, where someone in authority over the crew wanted to control what information survived. The Cape Lookout encounter is also something that distinguishes the Deering from most ghost ship cases. With the Mary Celeste, with the Joy Eater, there is no equivalent. No documented final contact with a witness who could describe what the ship looked like and who was speaking for it in the hours before it was found empty. The Carroll A. Deering had that witness. Thomas Jacobson, the keeper of the Cape Lookout lightship, saw the ship on January 28th, 1921. He heard a crew member hail from the bow, not the captain, not the first mate, but an ordinary crew member, which was already unusual. That man reported that the ship had lost both anchors. Jacobson tried to radio the report, but his own radio was broken. The Deering continued north. 3 days later, it was grounded on Diamond Shoals with no one aboard. That gap, 3 days, from the Cape Lookout encounter to the grounding, is where whatever happened, happened. And the Cape Lookout encounter tells us that at the time of that sighting, the ship was already in an unusual state. The captain was not speaking for the ship. The anchors were already gone. The crew member who hailed was described as having reddish hair and speaking with a foreign accent, which matched some descriptions of crew members but was not enough to identify who specifically was at the bow. Whatever disruption had begun aboard the Deering had already begun by January 28th. The ship was not functioning normally. The chain of command was already altered in some way. And then, in the 3 days that followed, whatever came next happened, and the ship arrived at Diamond Shoals empty. Among ghost ship cases, that kind of specific, dated witness disruption in the final hours before abandonment is unusual. It narrows the window. It tells us something was already wrong before the ship reached its final position. It also makes the mystery more specific and, in a way, more frustrating, because it means the answer is not lost somewhere in weeks of unwitnessed ocean. It happened in a 3-day window, in waters that were not remote, in a ship that had been seen by a lightship keeper who tried to report what he saw. The information existed. It just could not be transmitted in time, and by the time anyone was looking, the ship was empty, and the sea had closed over whatever had happened between January 28th and January 31st. There is something worth noting about what ghost ship cases tell us more broadly about the ocean as a place. The sea has always been a space where normal accountability breaks down. On land, when something goes wrong, there are usually witnesses, structures, roads that lead somewhere, buildings that retain evidence. At sea, especially in the early 20th century, a ship could sail for days without contact, and whatever happened aboard it happened in a space where the only witnesses were the people involved. If those people disappeared, the event disappeared with them. The ocean does not preserve scenes the way land does. It moves, it erases, it swallows. What washes ashore is selected randomly, not by relevance. The Carroll A. Deering left behind more than most. A grounded ship, a hot stove, smashed steering gear, a witness encounter, a federal investigation, and it still left behind nothing that could answer the central question. That is the particular cruelty of the Deering case, if you want to call it that. It gave investigators enough to know that something deliberate and significant had occurred. It gave them witnesses, physical evidence, documents, a ship they could actually board and examine. It gave them a timeline and a geography and a set of crew names and a letter from the captain expressing concern about his first mate. It gave them all of that, and it still did not give them enough. The evidence was sufficient to establish that the mystery was real and specific and human. It was not sufficient to resolve it. In the company of other ghost ships, the Carroll A Deering occupies a particular position. It is not the oldest, not the smallest, not the one with the most dramatic or disputed circumstances, but it may be the one where the gap between the quantity of evidence and the absence of a conclusion is most striking. The Mary Celeste had less to work with and produced no answer, but the Mary Celeste also had far less investigation behind it. The Deering had the full attention of the United States government, multiple federal agencies, foreign diplomatic correspondence, a formal special agent investigation, and still produced no answer. That combination, serious investigation, substantial evidence, complete absence of resolution, is what makes the Deering case sit slightly apart from the others. It is also what makes it feel, more than a century later, like a case that is still worth thinking about. Not because the answer is likely to emerge now, when it did not emerge in 1921 with the ship still accessible and the witnesses still living, but because the specific details of the case, the smashed steering gear, the food on the stove, the red-haired man at the bow, the unlit ship on January 29th, the letter from Wormel about Bates, Lula Wormel's years of correspondence that led nowhere. Those details are specific enough and human enough that the mystery does not feel abstract. It feels like something that happened to real people, in a real place, in a real 3-day window that no one outside the ship ever witnessed. The Carroll A. Deering is not a legend in the way the Bermuda Triangle is a legend, built on accumulation and selective framing, and a certain willingness to let atmosphere substitute for evidence. It is a documented case, with a documented investigation, and documented evidence that genuinely does not resolve into a clean explanation. That is rarer than it sounds. Most mysteries, when investigated seriously, yield at least a probable explanation, even if that explanation cannot be proven beyond doubt. The Deering investigation yielded several possible explanations and could not confirm any of them. Mutiny, piracy, a natural event, some combination. The evidence supports each possibility partially and none of them completely, and the people who were in the best position to know, the 11 crew members of the Carroll A Deering, are simply not available to ask. And that brings us, finally, back to the ship itself, back to the galley, back to the meal that was prepared for 11 men who never came to eat it. Because whatever the explanation turns out to be, whatever theory comes closest to what actually happened in those 3 days off the coast of North Carolina in January 1921, it happened to specific people on a specific ship in a specific place. And the image of that food still warming on the stove is the image that carries all of that specificity in the most immediate way. It is the detail that makes the mystery human rather than abstract. Someone lit that stove. Someone prepared that meal. And then something happened, and the meal was never eaten, and the people who had prepared it were gone, and the ship drifted onto Diamond Shoals with the stove still warm and the coffee still ready, and 11 names attached to a story that has no ending. That is where the Carroll A Deering leaves us. Not with a solved case, not with a fabricated resolution, but with the specific human weight of something that happened and was never fully explained. And there is one more thing worth sitting with before we set this story down entirely. The quiet fact of what the Deering leaves behind as a feeling, not just as a case. What it means to find a ship like this. What it means that a meal can outlast the people who made it. And that feeling is worth staying with for a moment, because it is not something that resolves easily into language. There is something specific about a prepared meal, about the act of cooking for people, that carries a particular kind of weight when the people never arrive. A meal is not an abstract gesture. It requires someone to gather the ingredients, to light the fire, to tend the pot, to know what the others want to eat, to time everything so it is ready when the crew sits down. It is one of the most ordinary human acts there is, repeated in every home and every galley and every kitchen in the world, every single day, without anyone thinking about it. And then something happens, and the meal is still there, and the people are not, and the ordinary act becomes something else entirely. It becomes a record of the last normal moment before whatever came next. That is what the galley of the Carroll A Deering was in the end. A record of a last normal moment. The pork and beans still in the pot. The coffee still hot enough to drink. Someone had been in that galley not very long before the Coast Guard cutter finally managed to board her on February 4th, 1921. The stove had been lit, the food had been prepared, and then something intervened between the preparation and the meal. What that something was, no one ever established with certainty. But the food was real. The stove was real. The heat still in the metal was real. And those things point to a very short window, hours perhaps, between the last human presence aboard and the grounding on Diamond Shoals. Willis Wormel's last letter to his daughter Lula was written from Barbados. It was a letter full of the kind of things a father writes when he is not quite saying what he means. Concern about the crew expressed carefully. Worry about the first mate Herbert Bates expressed even more carefully. The general sense of a man who was not entirely comfortable with the situation he was in, but who had been a mariner long enough to know that you do not always get to choose your circumstances. He signed off as a father does, not as a captain. He did not know it was the last letter he would send. Letters like that never announce themselves. You write them the same way you write any letter, and then something happens, and they become the last one, and the person who receives them carries that weight for the rest of their life. Lula Wormel carried it for years. She wrote to the State Department and the Bureau of Navigation and members of Congress. She interviewed people who had seen the ship, people who had spoken with her father, dock workers and sailors, and anyone who might have a piece of the picture she was trying to assemble. She focused on Herbert Bates because her father's letter had pointed her there, and because the evidence from Cape Lookout, the wrong man speaking for the captain, the unusual behaviour, the reported loss of the anchors, seemed to point there too. She never got a satisfying answer. The investigation that had the full weight of the United States government behind it, that had the State Department writing letters to over a dozen foreign countries, that had a special agent working under Herbert Hoover compiling hundreds of pages of documentation, that investigation also never got a satisfying answer. Lula Wormel's persistence did not produce what she was looking for, but it produced something. It produced a record. Her correspondence is part of the historical file on this case, and it is some of the most specific and human documentation in that file. It is the record of a daughter trying to understand what happened to her father, and it is still there, in the archives, 100 years later, still without a resolution. The unlit ship that was seen near the Deering on January 29th, 1921 was never identified. That fact deserves to be said plainly, without dramatic framing, because it is simply true and it is strange. Ships in that area in that period were not invisible. They had names, they had registrations, they had crews who went to ports and spoke to people. And yet the ship that was seen running without lights, ignoring signals, moving near the Carroll A Deering the day before she was found abandoned, that ship left no trace in any record that investigators were able to find. No one came forward, no port reported an arrival that matched. No sailor ever claimed to have been aboard it. It appeared in the witness accounts, and then it disappeared from history entirely, which is its own kind of strange. A physical object, crewed by people, seen by witnesses, and then simply gone from the record. The bottle note found by Christopher Columbus Gray on the North Carolina shore in April 1921 turned out to be a lie. The paper was wrong, the ink was wrong, the handwriting did not match anyone from the crew, and Gray himself came under suspicion for having written it. What that note tells us more than anything is how hungry people were for an answer. Someone, whether Gray or someone else, was so compelled by the mystery, or so motivated by something else entirely, that they fabricated a piece of evidence and introduced it into a federal investigation. That is its own kind of commentary on what the Deering case did to people who encountered it. It was the kind of mystery that made people want to fill the silence, even with something invented. The silence was that uncomfortable. The absence of an answer was that difficult to sit with, and the ship itself was destroyed. The Carroll A. Deering was towed off Diamond Shoals in March 1921, inspected at Wilmington, found to be structurally sound. No catastrophic storm damage, no evidence that the sea had done anything to the hull that would explain the absence of the crew, and then towed out and sunk with dynamite as a hazard to navigation. The last physical evidence of what had happened aboard her was removed from the world before anyone had figured out what that evidence meant. That is a melancholy detail, though it was a practical decision at the time. A grounded schooner on a dangerous stretch of coast is a real hazard to other ships, and the investigation had already examined what it could examine. But the result is that the ship that held the answers, if there were answers to be held, no longer exists. It is somewhere on the bottom, broken apart, scattered by a century of Atlantic currents, reduced to whatever the sea has made of it. 11 people left on that ship, their names are part of the historical record. Willis Wormel, the captain, Herbert Bates, the first mate, who Wormel feared and Lula Wormel suspected. The 9 other crew members, some of whose names appear in the documentation and some of whom are harder to trace. 11 people who boarded a 5-masted schooner in September 1920 and were never seen again after January 1921. No bodies were found, no survivors appeared, no one confessed to anything, no one was ever charged. The 11 names are attached to a story that simply does not have an ending, and that is not a literary device or a narrative choice. It is just the truth of what the investigation found, which was that it could not find an ending. What we are left with, then, is the specific shape of what we do not know, and that shape is actually fairly clear, which is part of what makes this case feel different from a simple absence of information. We know the ship left Barbados in late January 1921. We know it passed Cape Lookout on January 28th, and that the encounter there was unusual in several documented ways. We know an unlit ship was seen nearby on January 29th. We know the Deering was found grounded on Diamond Shoals on January 31st with both anchors gone, the steering gear deliberately smashed, the lifeboats missing, the ship's papers and log removed, and food still cooking in the galley. We know the federal investigation ran for months and produced hundreds of pages and no conclusion. We know Lula Wormel spent years looking and did not find what she was looking for. We know the hoax note was a hoax. We know the ship was sunk. We know no one was ever found. That is a specific shape. It is the shape of something deliberate and human that occurred in a 3-day window off the coast of North Carolina, witnessed only by the people involved and never reconstructed from the outside. Mutiny fits some of it. Piracy fits some of it. A natural event explains almost none of the deliberate details. Some combination of events, a mutiny that was then interrupted by something else, or a piracy boarding that followed internal conflict, or something else entirely that no investigator ever fully articulated, might fit more of it. But no explanation fits all of it cleanly, and the people who would know are gone. There is something the Carroll A. Deering does that very few historical mysteries manage to do, which is that it stays specific. It does not blur into legend the way some cases do. The details remain concrete and grounded and human enough that the mystery does not feel like mythology. It feels like something that happened to real people in a real place and was never explained, which is both simpler and harder than mythology. Mythology gives you a frame. An unsolved human event just gives you the event, and the silence after it, and the particular weight of not knowing. The meal on the stove is the detail that carries all of that, not because it is the most important piece of evidence. The smashed steering gear and the missing anchors are probably more significant from an investigative standpoint, but because it is the most human. It is the detail that places a person in a galley, doing something ordinary in the last hours before everything changed. It is the detail that makes the 11 crew members of the Carroll A feel like people rather than names in a file. Someone cooked that meal, someone tended that stove, and then whatever happened, happened. And the meal sat there growing cold while the ship drifted toward Diamond Shoals, and the January sea moved around it, and the coast of North Carolina waited in the grey winter light. That image is over 100 years old now. The ship is gone. The people are gone. The investigation is closed in the sense that no one is actively working on it, though it was never closed in the sense of being resolved. Lula Wormel is gone. The Cape Lookout lightship keeper who noticed the strange encounter is gone. The Coast Guard officers who first boarded the Deering and found the food still warm are gone. What remains is the documentation and the accounts and the specific details that have been preserved in the historical record, and the fact that none of those details add up to an answer. If you have a theory, if something in this story pointed you toward an explanation that feels more complete than the others, there is a comment section below, and it is a genuinely good place to leave it. Not because the case is going to be solved in a YouTube comment thread, but because the Carroll A Deering is the kind of story that makes people think, and thinking out loud about it feels like the right response to a mystery that has been sitting quietly in the historical record for over a century, waiting for someone to pay attention to it. Thank you for spending this time with the story, genuinely. If you listened all the way through, or watched, or had this on while the night settled around you, that means something. These stories are worth keeping alive, not because they will be solved, but because the people in them deserve to be remembered with some care and attention, rather than reduced to a single haunting detail or a footnote in a book about the Bermuda Triangle. Willis Wormel was a real man who wrote a real letter to his daughter and never came home. Lula Wormel was a real woman who spent years trying to find out why. 11 people boarded a ship and did not return, and nobody ever fully explained what happened to them. If you found this worth your time, a like helps this channel reach people who might not have found it otherwise, and subscribing means you will be here for the next story. There are more of them. There always are. For now, though, let the image rest where it is. A 5-masted schooner on Diamond Shoals, sail still set, no one aboard, and in the galley, a meal still warm, prepared for people who were already gone, on a cold January morning off the coast of North Carolina more than 100 years ago.